Chapter 141, Tony Steps In, and Bruce Banner's heart sank the moment he saw Mr. Blue, a disheveled, middle-aged man wearing thick glasses and a rumpled lab coat. The man gave a shaky grin and held up a small vial. "I've analyzed your blood sample, Dr. Banner. It's incredible." Banner forced a polite nod, though dread churned in his gut. In Marvel lore, Mr. Blue was really Samuel Stern, a slow-learning high school dropout who scraped by on odd jobs. In this version of events, Stern had resurfaced as Banner's anonymous online collaborator, promising to help develop a serum that could neutralize the Hulk once and for all. "When we began, I thought we might only suppress your transformation," Stern had told him over encrypted chat. "But the properties of your gamma-altered blood, they're far more potent than I ever imagined." And yet, Banner knew the serum's limitations all too well. It had succeeded in damping the Hulk's rage, but it hadn't eliminated him, only held him in check. That half measure had backfired spectacularly when the Abomination arrived. Unlike the Hulk, whose strength increases with anger, the Abomination's power plateaued. Stripped of his rage, Banner's green alter ego stood little chance, and nearly lost the day. Now Stern's obsession with Banner's unique biochemistry had grown dangerous. Behind that nervous smile lurked a man bent on isolating every precious compound in Banner's blood, patenting a miracle cure, and mass-producing it, no matter the cost. Banner swallowed. He should never have let Stern so close. As the lab's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, he steeled himself for what was coming next, unaware that Tony Stark was already on his way to intervene. "You cloned my blood?" Bruce Banner's voice trembled with fury as he stared at the rows of vials lining Dr. Sten's shelves. He'd only sent a small sample for analysis. How had Sten ended up with enough to duplicate it? "Of course," Sten replied matter-of-factly. "You can't do that," Banner snapped, fists clenching at his sides. His pulse raced with the familiar, terrifying promise of the Hulk. "I sent you exactly as much blood as I needed for tests. You had no right to replicate it." Sten held up a hand, as if to calm him. "You gave me too little to continue meaningful research. If I hadn't cloned it, I couldn't have made any progress." He paused, then added, "Besides, the real breakthrough is here. The inhibitory serum is finally working. Would you like to try an injection?" Bruce swallowed hard, wrenching his attention away from the cloned vials. His heart pounded at the thought of a successful serum, a cure, or at least a control, that might keep the Hulk locked away. "Is it really effective?" he asked, voice low. Sten nodded. "Preliminary trials show dramatic suppression of gamma-induced transformations. You could remain fully you." Banner exhaled, relief and skepticism warring inside him. He'd endured too many nights alone, scared to sleep beside Betty for fear of losing himself and endangering her. He still remembered the ache of finding her arm in another man's as he transformed and left, helpless. If this serum worked, he wouldn't have to run ever again. He might even return to Betty's side for good. "Prepare it," he said at last, steadying himself. "I want to try it now." Colonel Bronsky's eyes burned with obsession. If he could only kill the Hulk, he told himself, he would reclaim the genius he'd lost. Not long after Bruce Banner, courtesy of a secret serum, had finally suppressed the Hulk within him, Bronsky received word of his location. He mobilized a kill team and descended on the lab, only to discover his quarry had vanished. "Come on out," Bronsky snarled, seizing Banner by the collar. "Let that beast inside you show itself." Bronsky had earned more than enough battlefield honors to sit comfortably behind a desk as a colonel. In fact, he'd refused every promotion. He craved the heat of combat too much to be stuck in an office. When he first experienced superhuman strength by injecting himself with compound number 1, money he'd pegged together through years of savings, comrade loans, and bank financing, he felt invincible, his physical abilities not only restored but amplified beyond belief. Yet when he met the Hulk face to face, every last shred of confidence deserted him. The raw, untamed fury of that creature shattered his arrogance and left him desperate. Even if the Imperial Company's human body modification technology far outstripped Ethan's own, could he really afford to wait for them to perfect it? Their elite super bodyguards already outclassed anyone enhanced by compound number 1. Bronsky begrudged them so deeply that he seriously contemplated quitting and applying to join the company himself. That's when General Ross dropped his own bombshell. He'd secured a modified super soldier serum. Hungry for power, Bronski didn't pause to weigh the risks or wonder if it might conflict with Compound No. 1, he injected it on the spot. Ross offered no objections. After all, two madmen chasing strength were always a dangerous pair. Ethan remembered just how potent that serum turned out to be, far stronger than even Captain America's original formula. Most astonishing of all was its regenerative effect. When the Hulk's brutal kick shattered every bone in Bronski's body and mangled his internal organs, he healed completely in under a night and emerged even more formidable than before. Ethan tapped through the data on his tablet, frowning. This new super soldier serum looked like an optimized version of the original formula. Judging by Bronski's performance, his burst strength, lightning-fast reflexes, near-instantaneous healing, it was hard to believe General Ross hadn't already greenlit the training of 80 or 100 enhanced troops. With results this spectacular, Congress would have rushed to fund a full squadron of super soldiers. Before he could voice that question, his earpiece crackled. Banner had been detained by a military convoy. Ethan barely had time to register the news when a crimson and gold streak sliced through the sky. Iron Man had arrived. Moments later, Tony Stark's armor settled in front of a Humvee escorting Bruce Banner. General Thunderbolt Ross strode forward, face carved with authority. Tony hovered inches above the ground, repulsors humming. "General Ross," he said, voice calm but firm, "Bruce Banner is a civilian scientist and my personal guest. Explain why you're taking him." Ross's reply was a growl. "Stark, you're overstepping. You don't have the authority to meddle in military assets." Tony folded his arms, unruffled. "I'm not here to squabble over authority, but I will say this. Taxpayer dollars aren't supposed to vanish into secret labs without oversight. Why not let Monarch and other independent agencies review your super soldier program?" The general's eyes flashed. Tony pressed on. "Let me be perfectly clear. Bruce Banner is under U.S. military jurisdiction, not your personal property, and I intend to make sure he stays exactly where he belongs." Ross opened his mouth, then shut it again. He clearly had no retort ready. With that, Tony gave a nod and rocketed upward, his armor catching the last light of dusk. Left behind, Ross could only watch the Iron Man suit disappear into the sky, knowing full well that Stark hadn't finished this fight. "You have no right to take him away." General Ross's jaw clenched. He fully understood what would follow if this investigation and debriefing went through. The military would need a scapegoat to placate their corporate backers. Tony Stark was already too high profile for them to ignore, especially now that Project Monarch was in play. Everyone knew exactly whose actions had set this off. By the time they were done, not even the most well-connected heavy hitters would survive without losing everything that protected them. Ross leveled a steely gaze at Stark. "So tell me, do you really think I shouldn't investigate?" Without hesitation, Tony tapped his gauntlet, projecting Dr. Bruce Banner's dossier in midair. "According to my records, Dr. Banner is a free civilian. He's never signed a contract with your military." Ross ground his teeth, bewildered at Stark's relentless pushback. But before he could reply, a deafening roar ripped through the lab corridor. The floor trembled beneath their feet as a colossal yellow-green monster burst into view, barreling toward them with primal fury. Chapter 142, A Famous Scene Goes Viral. General Thunderbolt Ross stared in disbelief at the towering, jaundiced monstrosity before him. Tony Stark, his gleaming Iron Man armor reflecting the chaos, looked equally stunned. Wasn't the Hulk Bruce Banner's alter ego? Why was there another gamma-charged behemoth on the loose? Before they could process the impossibility, the creature's burning hatred locked onto Ross and Banner, who still lingered at the edge of the secure perimeter. With a feral roar, it lunged forward. "Open fire!" Ross's soldiers, battle-hardened from countless Hulk confrontations, unleashed a fusillade of bullets. But the abomination barely flinched. The rounds struck like pinpricks against living steel, failing to slow its advance in the slightest. Watching from a safe distance, Dr. Ethan Grant's curiosity flared. He recognized the telltale signs of Compound No. 1 reacting with the super soldier serum, an unprecedented second-stage mutation. Emil Blonsky had once prided himself on matching the Hulk's strength blow for blow. Now, after a clandestine second treatment, he'd transformed into something far more savage. The change was grotesque. Jagged bones protruded through stretched green-tinged flesh, forming a spiky exoskeleton that gave him a cadaverous, inhuman look. Where once stood a muscular warrior, now lurked a skeletal nightmare, equal parts corpse and predator. Bullets continued to tear through the air, but the abomination paid them no mind. With relentless fury, it closed the distance, its savage growls echoing across the battlefield. This was no longer a fight against the Hulk. It was a battle for survival against something utterly unstoppable. "Hold your fire." Tony sealed his helmet with a hiss, turned to General Ross, and rocketed into the sky. Ross's eyes gleamed with sudden realization. So that towering beast was Emil, Abomination himself. He hadn't expected the experiment to succeed. But now that Stark was on the scene, this was his chance. With Tony's help, they could capture Blonsky, reverse-engineer the process, and churn out an army of Hulk-level soldiers, 10 of them, or 100, and the balance of power would shift overnight. High above the battlefield, Tony targeted Abomination with a missile. The explosion rocked the monster, but he emerged unscathed and furious. "Stark!" Blonsky snarled and leaped across the chasm between them. Tony braced himself. His gauntlet's repulsors roared to life, as hydraulics locked into a high-pressure configuration. By applying the mechanics of a hydraulic press to his armor, he could deliver a blow of unimaginable force. Even he hadn't known just how strong it could be. He swung. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, and for a heartbeat, Tony wondered, who told him his greatest adversary would be Ethan, the same kid who demolished the Steel Overlord with a single punch? Abomination staggered under the blow, disbelief flashing across his grotesque face. That was all the opening Tony needed to press the attack. Blonsky didn't see it coming. With a roar, he lunged at Tony, teeth bared and claws slashing, determined to rip the tin can apart. Since acquiring Hulk-level strength, Blonsky had been intoxicated by invincibility, and what better way to revel in it than by celebrating the death of a capitalist? His mind raced only with destruction. Planning for the future was the last thing on his agenda. Then, Tony struck back. Blonsky caught a glimpse of rippling air around Tony's fist, something called a mock ring, but he refused to flinch. He grinned savagely and shot out a massive hand to seize his adversary. In the very next heartbeat, Tony's fist collided with Blonsky's jaw in a deafening boom. The shockwave shattered the air itself, hurling Tony hundreds of meters backward. His suit's thrusters flared in a desperate bid to slow him down. Without them, he'd have been launched even farther. On impact, the force left a network of hairline cracks across Blonsky's gauntlet, a stark reminder that even the strongest can be caught off guard. Even Tony himself hadn't expected his full-force punch to be so devastating. When his fist connected with Blonsky's helmet, the exoskeletal plating splintered like glass. Blonsky flew backward, his skull cracking under the impact, brain matter bursting out in a grisly spray. He hit the ground in a broken heap, and for a moment it seemed he might never rise again. But then Blonsky coughed, violently, and staggered to his feet. The monstrous vitality granted by his rage and the specialized regeneration from the super soldier serum kept him from dying of fractured brain tissue. He stood there, dazed, blood still trickling from the jagged wound in his skull. Tony lowered his arm, astonished at what he'd just unleashed. Even the Hulk might have crumbled under that blow. He knew the force of his punch approached that of a hydraulic press, powerful enough to kill him with the recoil if he'd pushed any harder. And yet, Blonsky was still standing. Seeing the abomination rise again, unsteady but unbowed, Tony's trademark grin faded. His eyes hardened with resolve. He hadn't come this far to back down now. With a deep breath, he readied himself for the next exchange. "Everyone, get out of here, now!" Tony Stark's warning came just as the armor plating on his right arm imploded, fragments pinging off the hangar floor. Bruce Banner darted forward, concern etched on his face. "Tony, are you sure about this?" Bruce asked. "You know the Hulk can't be controlled once he's out." Tony glared at him. He hadn't yet realized Banner was carrying an antidote to suppress the transformation. He assumed Bruce was about to unleash the Hulk. "I've already called in someone fast. You'll see soon enough." Banner's expression hardened. "This is my responsibility. Fenris exists because of my mistake. I won't walk away." Tony nodded curtly. "Fair enough. Just be careful." "Thanks for covering me, Stark." Banner said softly, then squared his shoulders and strode toward Emil Blonsky. The abomination snarled, muscles rippling beneath his skin, fists raised in challenge. Banner's voice dropped to a calm, even tone. Well then, I suppose this is the part where the real fun begins. Watching from the shadows, Ethan clicked his tongue. He'd seen Bruce Banner leap from a falling plane before, crash through the rainbow-lit arches of the Bifrost Bridge, and nearly die trying to save Asgard from Fenrir's jaws. Now that the antidote ran through Banner's veins, the Hulk would only emerge if Bruce was pushed to the brink of death. And no one, not even the abomination, was going to make that mistake twice. Ethan Banner had tried every conceivable way to end it all, swallowing poison, biting down on a pistol, only to have each attempt trigger the monstrous transformation into the Hulk. No matter how lethal the injuries, the change would heal him. That's why the idea of Deadpool laying waste to the entire Marvel universe always struck him as a bug in the system. If you wanted to stop Banner for good, you'd have to strike before he shifted. And if that were so simple, General Ross would already have succeeded. Initially determined to capture Banner alive, Ross had endured so many setbacks and losses that he dropped his standards. Merely securing the Hulk's remains would now count as a victory and a research prize. Ethan stepped tentatively forward, his pulse racing as he confronted the behemoth Emil Blonsky had become. Normally, the thought of towering giants would send a wave of dread through him. But this time, even though his heart hammered against his ribs, his body betrayed no reaction. He stood frozen, caught between the desperate desire to flee and the grim knowledge that escape might be impossible. Chapter 143. Beating Bruce Banner's pulse thundered in his ears as Emil Blonsky loomed over him. "Can't we just talk this out?" Banner rasped, scrambling to his feet. Blonsky's lips curled into a savage grin. Before Banner could brace himself, a single brutal kick from the abomination's boot sent him hurtling across the chamber like a rag doll. He slammed into the far wall with a bone-shaking crash, steel girders groaning under the impact. Then came silence, an oppressive, echoing stillness. Tony Stark sprang forward, eyes wide. "Jarvis, status report. What happened to the Hulk we were promised?" "Sir," came Jarvis's calm voice over the comm, "Bruce Banner's vital signs have plummeted. He's unresponsive, and there's no gamma signature detected." General Ross stepped into view, arms folded, his face a mask of irritation. "We didn't touch him. Banner simply refused to transform." Tony whirled on him. "You guaranteed he'd be safe here. Now look at him." He knelt beside Banner, checking for a pulse. "He's alive, just barely." Ross sneered. "We intended to study exactly that, why he can't Hulk out, but you wouldn't let us. You dragged him away." "I see now I underestimated your enthusiasm," Tony shot back, voice low and dangerous. A hush fell over the room as everyone processed the unfolding disaster. Then, from somewhere high above, a chilling voice cut through the tension. And just like that, all eyes snapped upward. Ethan descended from the sky with effortless grace, touching down in the ruined street as if he'd simply stepped off a curb. At the same moment, Tony Stark and General Ross looked up in surprise and irritation. "How old are you?" Tony barked. "And you're still pulling stunts like this? Kid's a kid after all." Ethan stood unmoved. His black armor hugged every contour, too sleek to be called plate mail, yet too substantial to pass for mere tights. A flowing cape trailed behind him, lending a faint echo of Batman's famous silhouette, minus the cowl and the excess bulk. "Ethan?" General Ross called uncertainly, shielding his eyes from the late afternoon sun. Across the street, Emil Blonsky, already halfway to becoming the monstrous abomination, caught sight of him and roared in delight. He lunged forward in a blur of muscular power. "Careful, Ethan," Tony warned. "That thing can take a hit and keep coming." Ethan tilted his head, gave a single nod, and with a swift motion delivered a thunderous slap. The crack echoed like a high-explosive grenade. Ross and Stark instinctively clamped their hands over their ears as Blonsky soared backward, smashing through a nearby house and careening out the other side in a cloud of splintered wood and plaster. Ethan landed softly on the pavement, dust swirling around his boots. He glanced over at Tony and asked, almost casually, "Is that it?" Tony exhaled, eyes still fixed on the smoking wreckage. "Not quite," he replied, "but you're off to a strong start." Tony froze as Jarvis's voice chimed in his ear. The force of Ethan's slap had rivaled or even surpassed Hulk's full-strength punch. No sooner had the words registered than a thunderous roar tore through the air. Tony spun around, expecting to see Blonsky flying through the sky, but instead found Bruce Banner sprawled, unconscious, in the wreckage of a shattered house. From the shadows, a massive green arm yanked free a chunk of debris. The creature it belonged to stepped forward, every muscle rippling beneath its bright emerald skin. Short, bristly hair crowned that now familiar head. "Hulk!" it bellowed, eyes blazing as it advanced toward the clearing. Tony's heart skipped. He hadn't counted on Hulk's return so quickly. Across from him, Blonsky, now the abomination, rose to his feet. A perfect circular imprint, the mark of Ethan's slap, stood out on his cheek, glowing faintly before fading away. Hulk's gaze flickered first to Tony and Ethan, then snapped to Blonsky, who merely glared back. But Abomination paid Hulk no mind. His eyes burned with disbelief and fury. How could this unassuming man have felled him so effortlessly? Without hesitation, Blonsky lunged at Ethan, intent on settling the score himself, leaving Tony to brace for yet another titanic clash. Ethan drove his boot down onto Blonsky's airborne form with brutal force. Bang! Blonsky cried out as he thrashed, clawing at Ethan's leg, but Ethan merely pressed harder. Finally, Blonsky's limbs gave out and he crashed to the ground in a heap. No sooner had Blonsky fallen than the Green Hulk charged in. Ethan raised his palm and unleashed a powerful chi wave. Boom! A shockwave radiated from his hand, slamming Hulk backward with far greater force than any artillery shell. Ethan had tested conventional weapons on the Hulk before. It was little more than a tickle. This, however, was something else entirely. The Hulk flew across the floor and skidded to a halt, his massive chest heaving. General Ross, along with his officers, rushed forward to inspect the aftermath. Green blood seeped from gashes torn across the Hulk's armor-like skin, pooling into a dark tide on the concrete. For decades, Ross had doggedly pursued the Hulk, convinced of his near invulnerability. Now that conviction lay shattered. "How is this possible?" Ross whispered, eyes wide. "The Hulk, he's hurt." Tony Stark stood a few paces behind, equally stunned. He'd watched Ethan dispatch two of the toughest opponents he'd ever known with chilling efficiency. As blood trickled around the fallen giant, Tony realized he'd never seen anything like it, and he wasn't sure he ever wanted to again. Ethan had expected the Hulk to give him a real fight, or at least to pose some danger, but so far the Green Giant hadn't managed more than a feeble swipe. "Not bad," Ethan murmured under his breath. At that instant, Blonsky, already halfway into his abomination form, spun around and lashed out, hooking a jagged claw across Ethan's chest. Calmly, Ethan drew the small karambit from his belt and drove it home. The blade pierced Blonsky's armored flesh with shocking ease. Blonsky's eyes went wide. He stared at the knife jutting from his chest as if it were impossible. "No way!" he gasped before collapsing to his knees and then onto the floor. Ethan didn't hesitate. He gave his arm a brisk shake, flicking away the blood. His personal bio-force field prevented the dagger from sticking, so the blade slid free as cleanly as a scalpel. Across the room, General Ross and Tony Stark gaped in stunned silence. Even the Hulk hadn't expected things to go down this fast. But the green behemoth wasn't finished. Gasping for breath, he hauled himself to his feet. Years on Sakaar had taught him more than brute strength. They'd taught him to speak. And his favorite word, the one he used for every mood, excitement, frustration, triumph, was this: Hulk. With a roar, the battered giant lunged at Ethan. Ethan didn't dodge. He braced himself, waited until Hulk was close enough, then delivered a swift upward kick. The sheer force of it sent the Hulk soaring into the air, his massive frame cutting a green arc against the ceiling lights. Ethan watched him go, expression unreadable. Around him, the echoes of battle died away. The playing field lay clear, and now Ethan intended to decide exactly who won this fight. Ethan sent the Hulk hurtling through the air like a rag doll. With a bone-shaking crash, the Green Titan slammed into the ground, gouging out a massive crater. Tony Stark let out a low whistle. Ouch! That had to hurt. General Ross's face went ashen. He'd banked everything on the Hulk's victory, but here he was, helplessly watching him get thrashed by this newcomer. Over at S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, Nick Fury stared at the live feed in stunned silence. Neither the foul yellow behemoth standing at Ethan's side nor the Hulk had stood a chance. Now more than ever, it was clear to everyone watching just how far Ethan outclassed the two giants. Chapter 144, Facing the Green Goliath. Nick Fury watched in stunned silence. Could it be that Ethan's human body enhancement technology was even more advanced than he'd imagined? He'd always assumed Carol Danvers to be the strongest human on the field, with the Hulk a close second. Ethan, former codename Luther, was powerful, yes, but surely not on the Hulk's level. Fury had been ready to coordinate a three-pronged assault. Ethan and Tony Stark would engage the Hulk and that other yellow-hued brute, while Agent Coulson brought up Hydra's energy weapons for support. Now all of that seemed utterly unnecessary. The Green Hulk crashed to his feet, eyes blazing, and let out a thunderous roar as he swung a colossal fist at Ethan. Yet Ethan met the attack with nothing more than a quiet smile. He raised both hands and, with what looked like the slightest effort, caught the Hulk's fist in midair. The punch stalled, redirected, and then slipped harmlessly aside as Ethan guided its momentum off course. Again and again the Hulk struck, bulldozer blows meant to crush, but Ethan danced through each one, deflecting, parrying, and twisting every powerful arc. Not a single strike found its mark. It was as if the very force of the Hulk's rage had been siphoned off by Ethan's hands. Fury's jaw dropped. This was no ordinary combat technique. This was a masterclass in neutralization. Every attack anticipated, every blow neutralized before it could land. Ethan stood perfectly calm at the center of the whirlwind, smiling at the Green Giant as though he were playing catch with a child. Even Fury had to admit it. He was witnessing something unprecedented, and for the first time, he wondered whether Ethan's enhancements had pushed him beyond the edge of human capability entirely. Ethan moved with an effortless grace that made even Tony Stark flush with envy. Every step, every pivot was smooth and precise, so unlike Stark's usual brute force approach to combat. "How does he do that?" Tony muttered, leaning forward. "Sir," Jarvis replied instantly, "my analysis suggests he's using a Yan Dynasty form of Tai Chi, supplemented by elements of Sancho Bagua." "Tai Chi?" Tony echoed, the words sparking in his mind. By the time this was over, he decided he would program his next Iron Man suit to replicate every nuance of that serene flow. He wanted that same elegance, that freedom of movement. "I have to learn this." Behind them, the Hulk was raging. His green form rippled with growing strength as the antidote's suppressive effects wore off. He lunged and thrashed against invisible bonds, each outburst of fury more terrifying than the last. Yet Ethan, calm, collected, simply adjusted his stance and sidestepped every assault. His expression never wavered. If anything, he looked more composed than before. Tony watched in disbelief as the Hulk's bulk and power swelled with each second. Still, Ethan remained unshaken. He understood perfectly well that Bruce Banner's alter ego was spiraling free of suppression, and yet he showed no sign of panic. If the giant green monster insisted on testing its own limits, so be it. Ethan was only too curious to see what would happen. "It's not good," Tony whispered, voice tense. "Is he getting bigger?" General Ross, standing nearby, didn't need to look to know the answer. "Hulk is the strongest there is," Ross said. "The angrier he gets, the stronger, faster, and more unstoppable he becomes." Ethan's eyes suddenly lit up. He'd almost forgotten the one ability he still had in reserve. "That's it," he whispered to himself. Tony Stark's tension was palpable. Ethan had managed to hold his own so far, but the Hulk was only getting angrier and stronger. At this rate, Ethan wouldn't be able to keep him at bay much longer. "What about a sedative?" Tony blurted out to General Ross. "Couldn't we knock him out cold?" "Do you think I haven't considered that?" Ross replied with a wry shake of his head. He'd already tried every tranquilizer in the arsenal. Tony slapped his forehead in frustration. Then Tony's eyes snapped back, to Ethan, who had fallen eerily silent. Ethan lifted his head, mouth opening wide, and let out a single steady command. "Breathe." Ethan inhaled sharply, drawing in air that seemed to shimmer in the charged atmosphere. Then he exhaled a frigid plume of breath, so cold it instantly crystallized. The vapor enveloped the Hulk in billowing white clouds, coating his massive frame in frost. The Hulk roared and thrashed, but the ice only grew thicker, until he stood frozen solid, his green form encased in a pillar of ice. Tony and General Ross stared in stunned silence. Nearby, Bronsky, who had recovered enough to rejoin the fray, suddenly went limp again. collapsing to the ground as if struck down. When at last Ross found his voice, it came out in a stunned whisper. How did you do that? Tony's eyes burned with curiosity. He knew Ethan had once possessed cryogenic breath. He'd learned about it the hard way, but Ethan had lost that power months ago. Now, in one decisive moment, he'd not only unleashed it again, but frozen the Hulk solid. How did you get it back? Tony asked, barely above a whisper. How did you restore your powers? Ethan took a steady breath, and then, in a single, controlled exhalation, snuffed out the miniature fusion reaction roaring at the far end of the laboratory. Tony Stark stared, slack-jawed. Unbelievable, Tony whispered. I've always thought Superman's freeze breath was pure comic book nonsense, but this straight-up defies every law of thermodynamics I know. He circled the observation deck, mind racing. Was Ethan the product of some clandestine human augmentation program? A 1 in a billion metahuman? Tony didn't know, but he was certain of one thing. He'd never seen anything like it. Before he could press Ethan for answers, the lab doors banged open. General Thaddeus Ross marched in, chest bristling with medals. Stark, he barked, you'll hand over both the Hulk and Emil Blonsky. They're U.S. military assets, and you have no authority to remove them. Tony met his glare without flinching. Actually, General, I've got all the proof I need of your human experiment programs and the casualties you left behind. People need someone to answer for tonight's disaster. Why should it be me? Ross's eyes narrowed. You think the public cares about your corner of the world, Mr. Stark? They'll side with the generals who defend the nation. They may not sway elections anymore, Tony countered coolly, but a few damning headlines and viral videos, and your entire command structure collapses. American public opinion isn't dead, it just hasn't met your brand of tyranny yet. Granted, overseas audiences, say in China, might not be as sensitive to that leverage, but here, a scandal of this magnitude will burn you alive. Ross's expression faltered, and for the first time, his rigid posture seemed uncertain. In that charged moment, Tony knew the balance of power had shifted. If only he could figure out what to do with Ethan next. General Ross bellowed across the hangar. Stark, I'm warning you, the entire military's behind me. Tony Stark didn't even flinch. Doesn't matter, he replied coolly. Even though he'd officially severed his weapons contracts, the U.S. government still wouldn't dare cross him, especially not with Ethan Morgan at his side. In exchange for Dr. Bruce Banner, Tony continued, you withdraw every last soldier from this facility. No strings attached. At that, Ethan rose from his seat and faced Ross directly. Tony shot him a puzzled look. Ethan? What are you doing? Ross's eyes lit up triumphantly. See, even your partner agrees. You're outgunned here, Stark. Tony folded his arms. He knew Ross wouldn't abandon his obsession with Hulk research. If anything, he'd push harder to experiment on others. Emil Blonsky was already a ticking time bomb. In Ross's hands, he'd become the next test subject. Leaning toward Ethan, Tony asked quietly, do you honestly want Blonsky on our side? Ethan's reply was flat, no way. Tony raised an eyebrow. Emil Blonsky, the so-called abomination, was the last person you'd recruit. That's it? Ethan shrugged, eyes steady. There was nothing more to say. Tony sighed and straightened up. If Ross was willing to forego Blonsky entirely, their deal stood. General Ross hesitated for a heartbeat, then gave the order. All troops, fall back. As the soldiers melted away, Tony exchanged a brief nod with Ethan. They'd walked away with Banner, and, at least for now, kept the abomination out of Ross's grasp. Mission accomplished. At least Ethan's explanation had cleared him of suspicion. He wouldn't be the fall guy after all. Together, he and Tony carefully escorted Bruce Banner, still encased in ice, back to the containment wing. During the fight, Ethan had triggered the liquid nitrogen cannons at just the right moment. The raging Hulk froze solid, his roars cut off mid-growl. Within seconds, the green giant's bulk shrank and relaxed, reverting back into the motionless form of Banner. Tony slapped Ethan on the back with genuine admiration. Liquid nitrogen, that's brilliant. Why didn't we think of this before? Nearby, General Ross ran a frustrated hand through his hair. He should have realized that extreme cold might incapacitate the Hulk. If only he'd deployed a similar weapon earlier, they could have saved themselves countless headaches and a lot of property damage. What none of them suspected, though, was that real victory only came because Ethan's strength kept the Hulk from breaking free. In truth, without Ethan's intervention, even thousands of tons of liquid nitrogen wouldn't stand a chance against the fury of an enraged Hulk. Yet for now, Banner lay unconscious and secure, and Ethan could finally breathe easy. Chapter 145, Hydra Moves. In general, Ross barked orders without hesitation. Secure Bronsky and move out. He couldn't afford to underestimate the former abomination, even feigning death as he had. Ross was certain that once Ethan and Tony were gone, Blonsky would bolt for freedom. With his monstrous strength and newfound powers, who could pin him down? Strangely, Ross had opted to transport Blonsky by armored convoy instead of airlift. Perhaps he assumed the transport plane wouldn't accommodate something or someone of that size. Luckily, Ethan's flight-capable ally was standing by, but for now, Ross believed he had everything under control. Suddenly, a deafening roar tore through the road. Tires screamed, metal screamed louder, and then came the explosion. Boom! The lead vehicle heaved violently, rolling onto its side. Inside, soldiers were thrown against one another, their bodies slamming into the steel frame. Bones cracked, flesh bruised, the air filled with shouts of pain and terror. General Ross was hurled from his seat, sliding to a skidding stop beside the wreck. Disoriented, he managed to pull himself up, only to freeze in horror. Through the dust and smoke, he saw figures stepping out of the shadows, tall, imposing, clad in the unmistakable green and black of Hydra. "Hydra?" Ross rasped, his voice cracking. The attackers moved with lethal precision, subduing Ross's men with stun batons and energy pulses. In moments, the corridor of overturned vehicles became a Hydra staging ground. Agents secured Bronsky's restraints, while two heavily armored operatives flanked Ross himself. Ross's heart pounded. He recognized them now, Hydra's own super soldiers, engineered for brutal efficiency. It was clear, they hadn't come to simply recover Blonsky. They were here to clean up every loose end. As a Hydra enforcer stepped forward to cuff him, Ross realized he'd walked straight into their trap. Ethan and Tony were already airborne, but down here, on the road, Ross and his men were, and would remain, completely at their mercy. Ethan pressed himself against the scorched hull of a Humvee, heart hammering in his chest. Across the desert plain, 4 figures emerged, Hydra's new weapons of mass destruction. Leading the charge was the man they called King Kong. A single gold tooth flashed under a face of metal-hard skin so dense that automatic rifle rounds simply ricocheted off. Each thunderous step he took sent ripples through the sand. Hot on his heels darted Ghost Shadow, a wiry assassin whose twin pistols barked impossibly fast, mowing down anything or anyone in his path. Behind them lumbered the Stone Man, every inch of his hulking frame sheathed in jagged, obsidian-like plates, as if he'd been carved from a living mountain. Finally, hovering at the edge of the carnage, was Ray. He absorbed ambient heat energy with every breath, then unleashed it in searing plasma beams capable of punching through tank armor or detonating on impact. U.S. tests had likened his blasts to anti-tank mines. General Ross's convoy disintegrated under the onslaught. Ethan swallowed hard as he watched soldiers fall, vehicles burst into flame, and defenses collapse like paper. Then a guttural roar split the air. From beneath the twisted remains of a collapsed transport shack rose the abomination, Emil Blonsky, still trapped in his grotesque, green-scaled form. He bent the iron bars of his restraints as though they were twigs, freeing himself in one bone-shaking effort. The monstrous figure towered over the ruins, muscle and sinew rippling beneath armored skin. The Hydra operatives paused. The Stone Man stepped forward, his obsidian plates catching the sun, and boomed out. "Blonsky, Lord Black Caesar requests your presence." The abomination turned, eyes glowing with furious intensity. He let out a deep, throaty growl, and then strode toward them, sealing his fate with each thunderous step. Ethan clenched his fists, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. "The leader of Hydra wants to see me?" Blonsky rumbled, his massive form hunched in the flickering overhead light. He'd spent the last few hours licking his wounds after the savage beating Ethan had delivered. The reminder was clear. Neither he nor the Green Hulk was invincible. Going it alone now would only speed his downfall. Returning to General Ross was never an option. Ross would dissect him for experiments. Again. This wasn't the full-scale New York disaster that had forced Ross to resign. Thanks to Tony Stark's intervention, the damage from Abomination and the Hulk had been contained. Ross still wielded power, and he wouldn't hesitate to keep Blonsky under lock and key for further study. No, Blonsky needed an ally stronger than any he'd faced. Hydra's recent campaign of terror across America was bold and unchallenged. That was exactly the kind of muscle he wanted. He cracked a crooked grin. All right, let's go see this Hydra leader. At his signal, Stone Man and the others sprang into action. In a blur of super strength, they descended on the perimeter guards. Soldiers fell beneath crushing blows, and armored vehicles were ripped apart like tin cans. Within moments, the squad left behind smoldering wreckage, and not a single enemy soldier standing. Satisfaction surged through Blonsky as they melted into the night. Hydra awaited, and with it, a path to true power. General Thaddeus Ross pressed a hand to his bleeding forehead, staring with mounting fury at the spot where the Stone Man and his Hydra operatives had just vanished. Damn it all! After weeks of painstaking work alongside Tony Stark and Ethan to track down Emil Blonsky, he'd finally secured his prize, only to have him snatched away in the blink of an eye. How had Hydra known exactly where and when to strike? Was there a traitor in his own unit? And without Blonsky in custody, how could he possibly explain this disaster to his superiors? Far below the surface, in a vast chamber lit by flickering torches, Blonsky collapsed to his knees, disoriented by the abrupt change in surroundings. He pushed himself up and found a tall, broad-shouldered man striding toward him. Black Caesar, Hydra's elusive warlord, whose very name sent shivers through Washington. Emil Blonsky? Caesar's voice was cool, almost casual. Blonsky's scowl deepened as he recognized his captor. Forced to remain in his hulking form for days on end before he could shift back, he'd felt every moment of that imprisonment in his bones. Now, dragged here against his will, he let the rage simmer just beneath the surface. Black Caesar stopped a few feet away, arms folded, his gaze assessing. "You look different," he observed. A bitter smile crept across Blonsky's lips. "Don't let the face fool you," he snarled. Inside, he was bristling with one thought: find a way out and make Hydra regret ever laying a hand on him. "Let's have a little exhibition match first. See how good you are and how good we are," Black Caesar announced with a booming laugh. Ethan raised an eyebrow at the direct challenge, but felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly the kind of straightforward test he lived for. No problem, who's first? He'd learned these conventions back in his army days. A friendly duel to establish rank. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped forward. "I'll take the first round." The massive obsidian figure across from him stirred, its surface gleaming like polished jet. "So you're the strongest of the challengers?" it rumbled, voice echoing off the metal walls. Ethan cracked his knuckles, the plates of his bone-reinforced gauntlets clicking softly. "The mightiest here is Lord Black Caesar," he said with a respectful nod. "I'm just next in line." The stone golem's faceted eyes flickered, surprised by Ethan's deference. It seemed to consider his answer carefully before giving a slow, approving nod. "Very well, let's begin." Black Caesar clapped his hands, and the arena lights intensified. Ethan surveyed the fighting pit. A broad expanse of alloy plating, pitted and scarred from countless bouts, the walls bearing the same battle-tested dents and roofs. This place was built for exactly this kind of confrontation. The obsidian golem raised one great stone fist. "Don't worry, I have no intention of killing you," it rumbled. Ethan smiled beneath his helm. "Neither do I," he replied, settling into a combat stance. "But let's see what you've got." Blonsky cracked his knuckles and flashed a cocky grin. "You said my lines," he taunted before lunging forward and driving his fist squarely into the obsidian stone man's chest. There was a thunderous "bach" as Blonsky staggered backward, rattled by the force of his own blow. The obsidian stone man, however, stood unmoved, his granite-like form unyielding. "That all you've got?" Blonsky growled, narrowing his eyes as he watched several tiny fissures bloom across the golem's torso. But within moments, those cracks sealed themselves, leaving only faint pinpricks where the stone had split. Blonsky's grin faded into frustration. He launched himself at the Titan again and again, each strike met with the same eerie resilience. When he finally collapsed at the creature's feet, gasping for breath, it was clear who held the advantage. The stone man reached down and brushed a handful of crumbling fragments from his chest. With that kind of strength, he rumbled, voice as cold and hard as granite, you're only fit to be a Hydra foot soldier. Bronsky spat out a mouthful of dust. The Hulk serum had amplified his muscles and reflexes beyond anything he'd ever dreamed of. Enough, he'd thought, to carve out a place for himself among Hydra's elite. Instead, he discovered that raw power alone still couldn't break through the defenses of their greatest creation. He remained on his hands and knees, staring up at the impassive stone colossus, as the weight of that realization sank in. Chapter 146, Nick Fury's Reluctance. Black Caesar's curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped forward to challenge Bronsky directly. Bronsky, surprised that Black Caesar would dare fight in person, realized this opponent wasn't to be taken lightly, perhaps even more formidable than the Obsidian Stone Man. His blood sang with the promise of combat, so he accepted without hesitation. "Watch yourself, sir," he called out as he launched a thunderous punch. The instant his fist collided with Black Caesar, Bronsky felt as though he'd struck an unbreakable wall. A shockwave of pain detonated behind his eyes, and his head buzzed with intolerable pressure. Overcome by a searing, tingling agony, he crumpled to the ground and writhed across the pavement. When the world finally stopped spinning and Bronsky forced himself upright, Black Caesar's face was stern, unreadable. "What was that?" Bronsky gasped, clutching his throbbing skull. From the sidelines, the Obsidian Stone Man strolled forward, hands clasped behind his back, a faint smile on his lips. "That," he explained evenly, "was the boss's spiritual power. He used telekinesis to neutralize your blow, then struck at your psyche. Your body may be tough, but your spirit, not so much." Bronsky sank back onto the asphalt, mind reeling. He had never experienced such agonizing mental assault. His thoughts were a blur beneath the relentless splitting headache. Ethan would have preferred that Black Caesar simply overwhelmed him with Obsidian Stone Man's raw power, rather than wielding that uncanny psychic ability again. Psychic power? Now it made sense why Obsidian Stone Man and his allies had bowed to Black Caesar so readily. This opponent was nothing to take lightly, and his mind control abilities were downright unsettling. If they ever teamed up, Ethan was afraid they'd be beaten before they even knew what hit them. "Ethan's strength is sufficient," Black Caesar said coolly. "Once you've nailed the transformation back into human form, join them on the mission." With those words, he vanished. Ethan's eyes widened. "That was the boss's teleportation," he muttered. "We were brought back the same way. If you concentrate on a destination, you can instantly transport anywhere on Earth, even to the opposite hemisphere." Obsidian Stone Man, serving as interpreter, repeated in astonishment, "Such a formidable superpower?" Only then did Ethan realize how small his world had been, like staring up from the bottom of a well. He'd seen a hulking green figure and assumed he'd glimpsed the strongest being on Earth. Having never fought the Hulk, he'd taken his own power for granted. Now he understood just how naive that assumption had been. Chapter X. Hydra's Gambit. Ethan had already bested both the Hulk and Obsidian, no small feat, so confronting Obsidian again should have been straightforward. Yet the question of who truly outmatched Black Caesar still nagged at Nick Fury. Hydra was proving far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Late that evening, Fury learned that Hydra operatives had ambushed General Thunderbolt Ross and made off with Bronsky. Fury slammed his fist onto the conference table. "Damn it! What a waste," he snarled. If Hydra got their hands on Bronsky, they'd turn him into a weapon against the next Avengers team they faced. And Ross, he'd become more of a liability than an asset. Hydra wasn't some fringe group. It was a global threat that had just struck at the heart of Fury's Avengers initiative. 2 of his key players were gone. Worse still, Tony Stark and his crew had insisted on taking Bruce Banner with them. Fury feared that brilliant mind would vanish into Stark Industries' orbit as well. My Avengers. Fury gritted his teeth. One by one, they were slipping away, chasing their own agendas, while he was left watching from the sidelines. With Captain America still out of action, Fury wondered if the initiative even had a purpose anymore. Even if Cap were revived, would he be more than just another soldier in an increasingly chaotic world? And then there were the so-called super soldiers, the ones injected with the experimental number 19 serum, popping up in unexpected places. Fury ran a hand through his hair. The pieces were scattering, and Hydra was setting the board. His jaw clenched. Hydra had crossed a red line. It was time to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Nick Fury's anger boiled over. He'd obtained Monarch Corporation's compound number 1, the so-called Superman serum, but using it had only brought him more headaches. Fury's rage peaked until he nearly collapsed, frothing at the mouth from the strain. In the next office over, Alexander Pierce, too, was rocked by Fury-induced chest pains. He suffered a sudden angina attack, but fortunately he'd been pre-treated with the same compound number 1. While it wasn't a cure, it relieved his heart pressure just enough to save him from collapse. Their ire had the same source, fresh intelligence pointing fingers at Hydra once more. Black Caesar and his faction had abducted Bronsky, an operative of Hydra's Eastern Cell under Pierce's command, and spirited him away without so much as a courtesy notice. That kind of brazen rudeness infuriated both Pierce and Fury. For Fury, the abduction was proof that Hydra's reach remained unchecked. For Pierce, it was a nightmare. Fury would zero in on the incident and uncovering Pierce's own Hydra ties in the process. The only consolation was that the kidnapping took place on a public street. Had it occurred within a secure military facility, the repercussions would have been disastrous. Instead, they were left scrambling to contain the fallout and cover their tracks, before Fury demanded blood. Tony Stark had brought Bruce Banner to the new Stark Tower he was putting up downtown. He couldn't deny a pang of envy whenever he looked at Ethan's sleek Imperial complex rising on the other side of the harbor. But at the moment, Stark Tower was nothing more than a steel frame, no cladding, no interiors, barely any working systems. That suited Tony just fine. If the Hulk ever snapped and wrecked the place, he'd lose little more than a few girders. Banner stirred on the makeshift cot Tony's techs had set up in one corner of the shell. His eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his gaze. He sat up slowly, taking in the exposed beams and haphazardly parked equipment. Memories of past transformations sometimes slipped away when he reverted from the Hulk to Dr. Banner, complete lapses or hazy fragments, but the sting of every blow he'd ever taken remained etched in his mind. "Welcome back, Dr. Banner," Tony greeted him, keeping his tone measured and polite. In the usual storyline, their first meeting had been aboard the helicarrier, an encounter Tony approached with more than a little trepidation. This time, he needed Banner's help, so he put any personal misgivings aside. Banner blinked at him. Then, recognition flickered. "Mr. Stark?" Tony offered a wry smile. "You know me." He paused, studying Banner's wary expression. "Let's get you settled in. We've got work to do." And with that, Stark guided the scientist deeper into the skeletal tower, unaware of how much chaos and camaraderie their partnership would bring. Bruce's eyes darted across the room and landed on Ethan, who was casually perched on the sofa, swirling a glass of red wine before taking a slow sip of cola. At the sight of Bruce stiffening, Ethan set his drink aside and called out calmly, "Easy, Dr. Banner. I've no intention of tearing this place to pieces." Bruce felt the tension drain from his shoulders at Ethan's steady voice. He drew in a long breath, forcing himself down into a cross-legged sitting position on the floor. He could feel the Hulk writhing just beneath the surface, angry, insistent, but Bruce clenched his jaw and held him back. Ethan quirked an eyebrow. "Looks like the big green guy isn't too happy about that." Bruce hesitated, words caught in his throat. Then he let out a ragged sigh and offered Ethan a grateful nod. "Thank you, Ethan," he said softly, "for stopping Abomination and for keeping the Hulk in check." Chapter 147, The Hulk Baby's Education. "Dr. Banner, we'd be honored if you'd join us," Tony Stark said, extending a hand. "We need your expertise." Bruce Banner hesitated. "My expertise?" he echoed. In the past, any summons usually meant they wanted to hunt down the Hulk, but recently, thanks to Ethan's uncanny ability to calm the beast, things had changed. Bruce ran a hand through his hair. "I lose control too easily when the Hulk takes over." Tony's expression turned earnest. "We know. That's why we have Ethan. He can help subdue the green guy long enough for you to get a grip." Banner's jaw tightened. Ethan was just a kid, but his gamma-based talents had, more than once, pacified Hulk's rage. Still, could he carry that burden indefinitely? Tony gave a wry grin. "It's not a permanent fix. Eventually, I'll upgrade Hulkbuster to handle him directly. But until then, Ethan's our best line of defense." Bruce let out a slow breath. There's no guarantee Ethan can contain the Hulk perfectly every time. True, Tony admitted, nodding. But between your strategic mind, my armor, and Ethan's calming ability, we can minimize both destruction and casualties. Hope stirred in Bruce's chest. With a plan in place, maybe the next transformation wouldn't end in another disaster. He finally met Tony's gaze and said, "All right, I'll help, but we do this carefully. No more innocent people caught in the crossfire." Tony smiled and shook Bruce's hand firmly. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Banner. Together, we'll keep the Hulk and the world in check." Ethan had spent years exiled in a remote corner of the world, effectively hiding his gifts and shelving his ambitions. He'd hoped to prove himself before devoting his life to gamma-ray research, and he admitted now to win his father-in-law's approval. He never imagined how things would turn out, and he still felt a quiet reluctance in his heart. "Dr. Banner," he began, meeting Bruce's eyes, "I don't think blindly suppressing or outright destroying the Hulk is the real answer." Bruce Banner stiffened. He'd long believed his only option was to eliminate the Hulk, whose mere existence had upended his life. He'd never allowed himself to consider another path. Ethan pressed on. "You're a scientist, Bruce. You know that science is a method, not a single formula. Take nuclear fusion. Tony stumbled on cold fusion when no one expected it. At first, everyone called it impossible, or worse, a hoax. He offered the example because he knew Banner would grasp it immediately. So why assume there's only one way to handle the Hulk?" Bruce's shoulders slumped. This was nothing new. Every antidote he'd devised, every theory he'd tested, had failed to rein in the monster within him. And right now, he didn't have a better idea. In the end, the Hulk emerged unscathed. Tony's curiosity flared. He'd planned to ask Bruce Banner for a sample of Hulk's genes and cells, hoping to study them and perhaps find a cure. Of course, Bruce would never agree. He was still too guarded around his other self. But Ethan surprised them both. "What if we tried talking to the Hulk?" he suggested. Bruce and Tony exchanged incredulous looks. "You can't communicate with him," Bruce said, shaking his head. Tony nodded. He'd never thought of the creature as anything other than a force of nature. Ethan leaned forward. "I see it differently. Maybe it's because I'm strong enough not to fear him. I can face him without panic, and that gives me clarity. Bruce, the Hulk is basically a child with infinite strength. He lashed out only because you attacked first." Ethan shrugged, confident in his outlandish proposal. Bruce Banner fell silent. He had no answer for such madness. Tony's eyes lit up, and a slow smile curved his lips. "So," he said, "we're going to educate the Hulk? Like he's a kid?" The idea was absurd, and somehow brilliantly daring. Ethan leaned against a workbench in the lab, watching Bruce Banner pace back and forth. "Here's the problem," he began, folding his arms. "How do we teach each other when there's a baby Hulk in the middle of it? At this age, he doesn't even understand right from wrong or value life the way an adult does." Bruce slowed his pace, rubbing his forehead. "He's a baby," he muttered. "Babies don't need lectures. They need guidance." "Exactly," Ethan said. "Hulk shares your memories, Bruce. All of Banner's experiences are in there too, but he doesn't know how to interpret them. What we need is communication. If you and the Hulk can reach some kind of truce, he might not take over so often." Tony Stark's voice crackled through the lab speakers. "Great, now we've got a baby Hulk who could get a doctorate by the time he's 5. Wonderful." Bruce shot Tony a wry look. "Communication, Tony. Every time the Hulk shows up, Banner blacks out. How do you suggest I talk to him?" Bruce frowned, turning the question over in his mind. Then his face brightened. "What if we record a message, everything we want him to hear, then play it back when Hulk takes over?" Ethan tapped his chin, impressed. "That's brilliant in its simplicity." Bruce gave a nod and waved toward the central holo console. "Jarvis, initiate an audio log. I want to record a clear, concise appeal to the Hulk. Then set up a 3-dimensional projection of me, so it looks like I'm standing right in front of him when he listens." "Recording now," Jarvis replied smoothly, the interface glowing as it began to capture Bruce's voice. Ethan exchanged a satisfied glance with Tony, who simply rolled his eyes and muttered, "Finally, something even I can get behind." "The holographic projection really outdoes the still image, doesn't it?" Tony said, swiveling in his chair as the 3-dimensional rendering floated above the table. Bruce Banner, still catching his breath from the experiment, offered them both a sincere nod of thanks. "Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Ethan." Ethan returned the gesture with a modest smile. Banner hesitated, searching for the right words. For years, he'd only blamed the Hulk, resented him even, without stopping to consider that the other half of his mind might have feelings, fears, or desires of its own. Every time the Hulk appeared, Banner's life teetered on the edge. Every time the world recoiled from the beast, he recoiled in turn. Banner edged closer to the observation window, staring at his reflection as if he could catch a glimpse of the green giant lurking inside. "The world's been cruel to me, so I've been cruel back?" he whispered. "Hulk, I'm Bruce Banner." Tony and Ethan watched quietly from the side until Tony finally broke the silence. "Do you think this approach will work?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair and studied the floating display. "Who knows? I've just mapped out a possible solution. Emotions and human lives are full of unknowns. I can't promise we'll succeed until we see the results. Remember, even in mathematics, you get irrational numbers." Tony nodded thoughtfully. "Right. If pure equations can surprise us, life can surprise us even more." After Banner finished recording, he let the Hulk take over. This time, the transformation was almost instantaneous. Tony snapped his fingers, and in a flash, Bruce Banner's 3D hologram materialized before the towering green giant. The Hulk, clearly aware of what had just happened, stared at the projection in silence for a long, tense moment. "Incredible," he rumbled at last. Tony's eyes widened. The Hulk's calm, deliberate reaction confirmed Ethan's theory. This wasn't a mindless beast, but an intelligent being capable of understanding and speech. "Banner Jr. doesn't like Hulk," the Hulk muttered to the hologram, his voice low and gravelly. Chapter 148, Bruce Banner joins the Hulk's thunderous footsteps rattled the hangar as he loomed over the tangle of machinery and fallen crates. He hated Banner, hated the idea that the mild-mannered scientist lurking somewhere inside him could turn on him at any moment. He snarled down at the floor. "Hulk hates little Banner." Tony Stark hurried forward, palms raised in a gesture of peace. "All right, big guy, settle down. I can't stand Banner either." He tapped the side of his armor. "I'm recording this. Bruce will see it when he gets here." Across the blasted concrete floor, Ethan leaned casually against a smashed drone. He grinned at Tony's frantic expression. "Are you really trying to calm the Hulk with friendship, Tony?" Tony's eyes bulged behind his helmet. "I'm here to keep the kids calm," he snapped, "not to referee a tantrum." The Hulk's massive green head swung toward Ethan. "Hulk, hate, dark guy." Tony chuckled, taking the bait. "Hulk doesn't like tin cans either," he quipped, tapping his armored chest plate. With a roar, the Hulk smashed his fist into the ground. The shockwave sent Tony sprawling across the hangar floor. "Tin can!" Hulk bellowed. Ethan stepped forward, laughter dancing in his eyes. "Oh, you're a real tough guy, aren't you?" he teased, arms folded. Tony scrambled up, dusting chips of concrete from his suit. He kept a wary distance. From beneath the cowl, his grin was sheepish. Only Ethan dared mock the Hulk like this, knowing the green giant wouldn't strike a friend. The Hulk huffed, chest heaving, then slowly let a rumble of amusement escape his throat. Ethan held his ground, meeting the Hulk's gaze without flinching. "Not bad, big guy," Ethan said, voice steady. "Now come on, give me your best shot." For a heartbeat, the hangar fell silent, everyone waiting to see if the Hulk would punch or decide to play along. Hulk's roar cut through the air, its tap sending a shockwave that mussed Tony's hair so thoroughly he could have charged for a haircut. Okay, Hulk isn't bad," Tony blurted, patting his head as stray strands floated down around him. Ethan didn't waste a second. "Hulk," he called firmly, stepping between Tony and the furious green giant, "do you want people to like you?" The Hulk froze, chest heaving, his massive fists clenching and unclenching. For an instant, the furious green light in his eyes softened as he seemed to consider Ethan's question. Then Ethan held out his hand, palm open and steady. "No one's going to hurt you," Ethan said quietly. "We can be friends." The Hulk's gaze locked onto Ethan's outstretched hand, and something in his posture shifted. Ethan kept his voice calm and inviting. "We need you, Hulk. We accept you. You're one of us, part of our family." Tony hovered at the edge of the scene, glancing back and forth between the two men. He admired Ethan's courage, but didn't yet feel brave enough to join in. The Hulk frowned, staring hard at Ethan's palm. His great green shoulders tensed as he battled some inner turmoil. Tony saw it happen. The Hulk hesitated. Doubt flickered in those enormous eyes. Then, as if spurred by Ethan's steady friendship, the Hulk took a shaky step forward. No, I'm not afraid, Tony said under his breath, surprising himself. Gathering his nerve, he too moved closer, ready to follow Ethan's lead. Together, the three stood in the clearing, Man, Genius, and Green Goliath, on the brink of a new alliance. Ethan watched, incredulous, as Tony quipped, "Hey, Stark doesn't like bad boys, but Hulk, you're a good boy, right?" Tony's face flushed a little at his own words, but strangely, he felt better, almost as if letting loose the same frustration he'd once hurled at his father. Ethan cleared his throat and called, "Hulk!" The giant green figure seemed about to say something more, but excitement made him eke out only that one word. Then, gently, Hulk reached down and grasped Ethan's hand. Ethan's expression didn't flicker. Even if the Hulk had been a raging monster, Ethan's calm heartbeat remained unchanged, and Hulk noticed. Okay, Hulk said in a low rumble, not used to shaking hands. Tony hesitated a moment, then extended his own hand. Hulk's massive palm enveloped it, and Tony half expected the bones to pulverize under the pressure. Yet the grip was firm but careful, controlled. Tony let out a relieved breath. "Hulk, friend," he managed, a grin breaking across his face. Hulk gave both their hands a friendly shake. Then, almost too quickly to follow, his great form folded in on itself. Muscles receded, green skin faded, and where the towering behemoth had stood, now stood Bruce Banner. A small, uncertain smile crept across his face as he looked from Tony to Ethan. Ethan relaxed for the first time since they'd arrived. This was going to be an interesting partnership. Bruce Banner opened his eyes, still fully conscious even after that first terrifying transformation. He stared down at his massive green hands in astonishment. "Well, that actually worked," he muttered. Ethan stood nearby, arms folded and a satisfied smile playing at his lips. Tony Stark watched him, realization dawning. Ethan had been right all along. The Hulk was nothing more than a frightened child craving approval, especially the kind he'd never quite gotten from a father. Stark's jaw clenched. "Unbelievable," he said, voice low. "This is the first time the Hulk hasn't turned everything to rubble." Banner let out a shaky breath, relief and bewilderment warring in his eyes. "Ethan," he said, "maybe you should practice talking to yourself in the mirror. Hulk seems to listen better that way. And don't hesitate to let him out more often. Stark here won't bat an eye if another wall gets knocked down." Ethan grinned. "Relax. I'll build him a playground, something like an amusement park. Kids that size love roller coasters and bumper cars." Tony rolled his eyes but stayed silent. He didn't share Ethan's paternal instincts, yet he couldn't find a good comeback either. Banner watched the exchange, a bittersweet smile forming. He'd never imagined that, years before marrying Betty, he'd get a taste of fatherhood through his own green alter ego. With a resigned nod, he accepted this strange new chapter of his life. Ethan watched Bruce Banner's retreating back, then turned to Tony with a teasing grin. "So, I guess I'm supposed to get along with the Hulk now, like a son with his dad?" Bruce paused in the hallway, his expression a mix of relief and uncertainty. Finally, he nodded. "That's the deal," he murmured, and continued on his way to his quarters. Tony Stark waved a hand dismissively. "You've been it this way too long, Bruce. Go get some rest." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Wow, Mr. Stark, comforting people now? Who knew?" Tony rolled his eyes. "Hey, I only go soft for people I actually like, kid. Consider yourself lucky." As Bruce disappeared around the corner, Ethan let out a slow whistle. "Well, I guess it's official. Banner's in. The Illuminati's whole plan falls right into place when the guy who's scared of hurting people no longer has to worry about collateral damage." Tony shrugged. "Banner can fly the Quinjet, swing by if anything goes south. But just in case he's not around, I went ahead and bought up most of the land around Stark Tower." Ethan frowned. "Stark Industries isn't exactly booming these days. What are you doing with all that empty acreage?" A rare, satisfied smile crossed Tony's face. "Let's call it high-end real estate for the Hulk. No power plants, no solar arrays, just an enormous, reinforced field where Banner can go full rage without smashing a single civilian car." Ethan laughed. "A playground designed for smashing." "Exactly," Tony replied. "It's time the big guy had a place to let loose, and I'm not about to let him turn downtown Manhattan into Swiss cheese." Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. Well, bravo, Mr. Stark. You really are full of surprises. Tony raised an eyebrow. Stick around long enough and you'll see plenty more. With that, the two of them turned back toward the main lab. Stark Tower gleamed in the mid-morning sun, a fortress, a factory, and now Hulk Central. Perfect, Tony thought, for an alliance that had to keep secrets and stay sharp, and for a guy who needed the occasional smash fest without collateral. Tony turned to Bruce Banner and discovered that Banner was far more brilliant than he'd first assumed. Though their specialties lay in different arenas, their talents dovetailed perfectly. The Illuminati never insisted on a single discipline, but prized a diversity of expertise. Still, Tony's pressing concern was materials science. He needed a stronger alloy, because the metals in his Iron Man armor were starting to show their limits. Chapter 149. Long Live Hydra. Hydra's resurgence had turned Tony Stark's world upside down. Gone were the quiet days of fine-tuning gadgets between missions. Every encounter now threatened to outpace his latest armor. No matter how many power or software upgrades he slipped into the suit, its fundamental weakness remained the same: the materials themselves. Even if he perfected his arc reactor and AI systems, steel and titanium could only take so much, and his final knockout blow against Abomination had proven it, nearly tearing his armor apart in the process. During a late-night strategy session, Tony paced the workshop, muttering about yield strength and fatigue limits. That's when Ethan, a brilliant young engineer Tony had mentored, leaned forward with a spark in his eyes. If new bulk materials aren't on the horizon, Ethan said, why not go microscopic? Think nanorobots, swarms of programmable machines that form your suit. They could rearrange themselves at the molecular level to reinforce weak points, absorb shock, even self-repair after damage. Instead of chasing ever-stronger alloys, we'd let these nanites adapt in real time. In the coming decades, breakthroughs won't come from new metals, but from mastering the microscopic. Tony froze, mid-stride. The room fell silent, except for the hum of power conduits. Then, like a bolt of lightning, Ethan's vision struck him. Of course, dynamic, self-assembling armor. Why had he never considered it? His eyes brightened behind the helmet's HUD. You're right, we shift to nanotech. Let's get to work. As Hydra's threats loomed larger than ever, Tony knew this shift, from static plates of metal to an army of microscopic defenders, would redefine the future of his armor, and perhaps the fate of the world. Tony might have come up with the idea on his own, but Ethan was just a fraction quicker, and Tony wasn't one to back down or to argue over nanobot theory. He simply answered, "This suit I'm wearing, it's built from nanobots." Ethan paused, then tapped the jet black plating covering his torso. "Nanobots? You've already perfected them?" Tony studied the sleek armor, surprised by its seamless integration. "Yeah, but I ran into the same problem you did. Regular fabrics can't handle supersonic friction. My old suits literally shred or burn to ash anytime I break the sound barrier." Ethan nodded evenly. "I haven't activated my biogenic force field yet, so my backup was obvious, a nanobot shell that repairs itself on the fly. And by the way, I got them up and running before you did. Let's just say none of your suits have been upgrading as fast as mine." Tony leaned back, processing the information. "Makes sense. No biological field means intense air friction, exactly the kind of stress an ordinary suit can't survive." He finally understood just how impressive and potentially dangerous Ethan's supersonic speed really was. Without the right armor, even the smallest rip could bring the whole thing down. Tony Stark stared at the telemetry streaming across his HUD. Ethan's suit had just punched through Mach 5.4 in a clean dash across the desert range. No ordinary armor could survive that, Tony muttered to himself. Not without a gold titanium chassis, and even then, only if it's reinforced with nanotech. He ran a hand through his hair. The kid had beaten him to it. Ethan lounged against a nearby rail, cool as ever. "Need a few pointers on my nanorobots, Mr. Stark?" he offered with a grin. Tony smirked. "I'm good, thanks. I'd never take tech from some upstart who makes my career look old-fashioned." Unfazed, Ethan flashed a challenging look. "All right, but I'll be waiting for your first nanosuit then. Let's see if you can best me." As he walked away, Ethan couldn't help but think ahead. Once Tony reverse-engineered that blood-edge nanobot armor, he'd finally qualify for the cosmic-level combat corps, and maybe even stand a chance against Thanos himself. Still, something about it all felt a bit too easy. Ethan stared at the hollow projection of the Blood Edge armor floating above Tony Stark's workbench. On paper, it looked powerful, but in every test run, it still fell short of its comic book legend. Tony tapped a few commands into his gauntlet interface and sighed. In the comics, the Extremis-powered version of this suit practically rewrote the rules of combat, but real-world Extremis was a completely different beast, and Stark wasn't sure he could bridge that hundreds of millions of points gap. Tony pushed himself away from the bench. "I'm onto something, Ethan," he muttered, ignoring Ethan's raised eyebrow. "Just give me a minute." With nothing to do but wait, Ethan slipped into the corner of the workshop and checked his phone. A mischievous grin spread across his face. He hit record, aimed the camera at Tony, muttering, "Long live Hydra," under his breath, and uploaded the clip to the network before Stark even knew what was happening. No sooner had the video gone live than Ethan noticed Captain America, Steve Rogers, charging down the street outside the workshop windows. Rogers had only just awoken from his S-Shield recovery protocol, but his enhanced nerve reflexes and razor-sharp instincts were already telling him that this was no routine check-in. The nurse on duty had slipped up, mumbling through her excuse. Even the radio in the ward was playing yesterday's baseball game, the one Rogers had watched live. Why would they broadcast an old match? It didn't make sense, unless someone inside S-Shield was covering their tracks. Rogers slammed his shoulder through the reinforced steel wall without hesitation. Dust and debris rained down as he vaulted into the sunlight. He wasn't running toward safety, he was running from it. In Steve Rogers' mind, he was moments away from being drugged, subdued, and turned into someone else's pawn. And whoever was responsible, Hydra, S-Shield, or even Nick Fury himself, was about to learn just how wrong they'd been. Ethan stepped out into the street and froze. All around him, traffic roared past gleaming high-rises, and dozens of huge video screens loomed overhead. On one of them, a man with a waxed mustache stood at a podium and bellowed, "Long live Hydra!" Ethan's heart skipped. Hydra? How could that be? Hadn't Hydra been crushed? Had he slipped so far into unconsciousness that the world had changed without him? A woman in a business suit stopped beside him, jaw-dropping as she watched the broadcast. "Isn't that Tony Stark?" she whispered. "Why is he shouting, 'Long live Hydra'?" Across the sidewalk, two men argued. "He looks so awkward up there. It can't be real." "Real or not, I'm filing a story on it. Bonus for first scoop." "You're nuts. That's one of the wealthiest tycoons on the planet. I'd sue you for libel." Ethan's brow furrowed. The last thing he remembered was Hydra agents ambushing Stark and nearly killing him. Now the hero himself seemed to be leading Hydra's revival. Where was Howard Stark in all of this? On the street, Ethan found himself ringed by gleaming black Chevrolets. The doors of the lead car swung open, and a tall, dark-skinned man in a sharp suit stepped out. At the sight of the screen, one of his eyes went wide. "Are you with Hydra?" the man demanded. Ethan stared at the rows of suited agents around him, coldly gathering his wits. If Hydra had truly risen again, he'd need every ally he could find. "Captain, please, calm down," Nick Fury said, taking a careful step closer. "The world isn't what you think it is right now. You've been frozen for 70 years. Ethan's mind raced. Tony Stark shouting, "Long live Hydra"? Was it a joke, or had someone somehow revealed that Howard Stark's own son was working for Hydra? The idea was absurd. 70 years, he whispered, voice cracking. In that moment, the unshakable resolve Ethan had carried for decades finally crumbled. I was so late, he choked out. I missed everything. He hated to believe it, but nothing else made sense. The faces around him, the new technology, the world at peace, it all pointed to one stark truth. I'm sorry. Even though my father searched for me, it's too late. Fury fell silent for a long beat, studying Ethan's stunned expression. Then he spoke, his voice measured but gentle. Welcome back, Captain. Chapter 150, The Good Man. Ethan's eyes flickered open as the cold, sterile light of the infirmary washed over him. His first thought was Carter. He bolted upright on the gurney, voice trembling. Where's Carter? Nick Fury, his sharp gaze hidden beneath the familiar eye patch, sighed. He stepped forward. Agent Carter has aged into retirement. We've placed her in the S-Shield care facility, upstate. 70 years had passed since Ethan fell beneath the ice. Now, with medical teams steadying him, Fury led him down a silent corridor toward S.H.I.E.L.D.'s tri-wing building. In a secured briefing room, a Stark Industries holographic projector sprang to life, bathing them in floating diagrams and historical timelines. "Everything in your world has changed," Fury said. He tapped the console, and a timeline spanning decades unfolded in midair. World crises, emerging threats, the rise of new heroes. "We rebuilt S.H.I.E.L.D. from the ashes. We've dealt with Hydra infiltrations twice over, founded new teams. You're not the only one adapting." Ethan watched as images of the modern Avengers cycle before him, a billionaire in powered armor, a genius archer, a philanthropist with hidden talents. Fury's tone grew urgent. "We need you. Your leadership, your moral clarity, that's what holds them together." Unseen by either of them, a shadowed booth at the back of the room housed Hydra's real watchers. Alexander Pierce, director of the World Security Council, peered through tempered glass. Fury had no idea his every word was being recorded, nor did Ethan suspect how far Hydra's roots had sunk into S.H.I.E.L.D.'s hierarchy. Fury placed a gloved hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We've got one last mission before we ask you to join the team in earnest. But first, I want you to meet the others." As the holographic display faded, Ethan's heart pounded. Not from fear, but determination. The world had changed, but its need for heroes had not. And Ethan Rogers, awakened after 7 decades, was ready to answer the call. Nick Fury couldn't stand to see Steve Rogers so adrift. He folded his arms across his chest and gave the frozen hero a hard look. "Captain, we didn't wake you up just to watch you sit there. We need you back out there." Steve rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the world around him. Everything felt alien. The gleaming computers, the humming engines, the half-forgotten weight of time. "Sir, why now? Why bring me back?" Fury's expression went serious. "Because Hydra's not dead. In fact, they've grown, far beyond anything you ever saw." Roger's eyes narrowed. "Hydra? But I crushed them when I took out the Red Skull." He remembered the cosmic cube's power, remembered the skull disappearing into nothingness. He had assumed that was the end of Hydra. Fury motioned toward a cluster of monitors along the wall. "We lost track of Red Skull long ago. In his absence, someone else stepped up to lead, a man known only as Black Caesar." The screens flickered to life with grainy surveillance footage, Black Ops soldiers outfitted with gleaming cybernetic implants, hulking monsters with unnatural strength, and chilling images of Emil Blonsky's brutal transformation into the Abomination. "Hydra spent decades regrouping in the shadows," Fury continued. "They've built new weapons, new armies, some of them with abilities that rival ours. We've seen metahumans under their control, bioweapons that can tear a city apart." Steve stared at the feed, jaw clenched. He felt the old surge of determination rise in his chest. Hydra might have returned, and they were deadlier than ever, but so was he. "Then let's go shut them down," he said, voice low and resolute. Fury gave a curt nod. "Welcome back, Captain." Nick Fury tapped the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the data hovering above his tablet. "The real nightmare," he said quietly, "is that Hydra's captured Blonsky. Once they crack the mass production of Hulk-like soldiers, we're doomed." He swiped through images of Gamma Labs and schematics. "I always thought the Hulk was a ONU, EOF. But after General Ross and his team managed to create a second Hulk, it became clear the process works. And now Hydra's got Emil Blonsky, the key to building an army of Hulks." Steve Rogers sharpened his focus. "What kind of numbers are we looking at?" Fury's expression darkened. "With Hydra's covert research facilities and global reach, they could churn out hundreds, maybe thousands. Even if we have the Hulk himself, and Ethan, who's even stronger, how do 2 guys take down that many? They'd be completely swamped. I'm no match for a platoon of Hulks, let alone an army." Steve leaned back, processing the scale of the threat. Hydra, resurrected decades after World War II, was more terrifying than ever. How could one super soldier stand against it? Fury read the question in his gaze and offered a faint, determined smile. "I know, Cap, but I've got a plan." The overhead lights dimmed, and Fury tapped the console. In the center of the room, a 3D holographic projection sprang to life, revealing 2 silhouettes. Steve's breath caught when he recognized the first, someone whose reputation alone had impressed him since their earliest days in the field. Steve Rogers leaned forward, brow furrowed. I could have sworn I heard Tony Stark shout, "Hail Hydra!" in that video. Nick Fury closed his eyes for a moment, rubbing his temples. The fallout had been swift and brutal. Hydra's reign of terror was already pushing the world to its breaking point, and seeing Iron Man himself apparently endorse them threatened to plunge everything into chaos. Within hours, every influential defense contractor that had been vying for Stark Industries' weapons was dismissed from government circles. But Tony Stark wasn't panicking. He knew he had powerful allies. Ethan and the Imperial Company stood firmly on his side. What did he have to fear? Fury understood why America's most powerful figures had gone cold feet at the thought of Ethan's unpredictable genius, and why Stark had flooded him with arms contracts. Contracts that, as of now, were all null and void. Even if they hadn't been canceled, Tony would have no idea how to rein in Ethan. The man was in a league of his own. Stark's version was simple. It was a Hydra setup, and nobody should trust the footage. He'd done everything in his power to stop them from getting that recording, but he'd missed the hidden camera. Now the world saw him as a traitor, and Hydra was watching, knowing full well they'd planted the seed of doubt at exactly the right moment. The hollow display above the conference table burst to life in stunning, razor-sharp detail. Every seam of that steel suit, every gleaming panel, stood out in vivid relief. Ethan watched the projection in silence, his expression unreadable, but his stillness spoke volumes. He believed what he was seeing. Tony Stark, usually unflappable, felt a lump form in his throat. He exchanged a look with Steve Rogers before murmuring, "Is that really Howard's boy?" Steve let out a long breath, relief softening the tension in his shoulders. Hydra couldn't possibly have engineered something like this. It was absurd. Nick Fury nodded. "It is. He's the man who changed the course of modern warfare. Howard's son built that steel suit." With a few deft taps, Fury scrolled through archival footage, the ironclad figure sparring with the Iron Overlord, repulsor blasts lighting up ruined cityscapes, the classic moments that defined an era. "If we'd deployed weapons like this back in Red Skull's day," Fury said, "Hydra would have been crushed before it ever got started." Steve watched, awe and pride warring in his voice. With a suit like that, Hydra doesn't stand a chance. But even this wasn't the final answer. He shook his head. Then history threw us its greatest surprise of the century, a genius unlike any before him, Ethan. Fury leaned back, admiration softening his usual tough guy facade. "Even now, he won't agree to meet me. He hasn't set foot inside the Imperial Company's gates. Yet everyone calls him the brightest hope we've got for Keswick, curing humanity's deadliest diseases." In that moment, the room fell silent again, this time in recognition that the true revolution lay not in weaponry, but in the mind behind it. In truth, Emperor Pharmaceuticals had developed a breakthrough drug specifically for treating AIDS and arranged for it to be distributed through a well-respected charitable organization. Steve's research confirmed that this charity was legitimate, not a front for money laundering, and focused its efforts on patients who'd contracted HIV through blood transfusions or mother-to-child transmission. To date, they'd purchased the new medication in bulk, and tens of thousands of lives had been saved. When Steve learned all this, his opinion of Ethan improved dramatically. He'd always known that Tony was Howard's son, and he couldn't quite shake a lingering sense of resentment toward him. But compared to Tony's privileged background, Ethan's integrity and genuine concern for those in need made a far stronger impression. Chapter 151, Hydra Attacks. Steve Rogers leaned forward in the dim glow of the command center's holographic display. On the screen flashed dossier after dossier of startling data on Ethan, the man formerly known as Luthor. Fury stood aside, arms folded, watching Steve's eyes widen with each new entry. First came the headline, a one-shot superhuman serum, a radical compound that permanently augmented human physiology. Beneath it, detailed test results on the so-called Compound Number 1 and its even more potent successor, Compound Number 2, which amplified every enhancement of the original formula. The files explained how Emperor Company's private security force, an elite unit created to hunt Hydra operatives, had been built around these breakthroughs. Then, the most unbelievable revelations appeared. Ethan's own self-devised super-era body modifications, He'd locked in flight capabilities, near-instantaneous reflexes, and a near-invulnerable frame. His new arsenal included devastating energy blasts, heat vision, and a form of cryogenic breath that, the dossier claimed, rivaled the strongest thermal weapons in existence. Holographic clips even replayed Ethan single-handedly dismantling Hydra squads, moving so fast and striking so hard that entire convoys collapsed before they realized what hit them. Steve shook his head, scarcely able to believe his eyes. All this is him? Fury nodded calmly. Ethan's a genius in biology, ergonomics, and genetics, on a level that makes the best minds in S.H.I.E.L.D. look like interns. Not even Dr. Erskine or Dr. Reinstein could match him. Nobody knows exactly how he engineered these upgrades, and no one can replicate his work. Think of it as Tony Stark's armor and arc reactor, only grown from living tissue. Steve absorbed the magnitude of it. He really might be the ultimate weapon against Hydra. Fury's gaze was steady. Exactly, and Hydra knows it. That's why they're striking now. But Nick Fury couldn't shake his doubts. Ethan simply wasn't on Carol's level. She was out among the stars dispensing justice, while he remained earthbound, and Fury found that hard to accept. "I can't even picture it," he said to Steve Rogers over the secure channel. Steve let out a rueful chuckle. He felt like an ancient soldier stuck between two brilliant minds. "Honestly, Nick, with you calling the shots, I'm confident they'd take Hydra down." Fury's eyes brightened. "So you think they can't manage on their own?" Steve shook his head. "They're brilliant, but also reckless. Without someone experienced to guide them, they'll stray from the mission. Only you can give them the direction they need." Fury leaned forward. "Especially Tony. He's a notorious playboy. You know he can't stay focused when there are prettier distractions elsewhere." Steve grinned. "That's why I want to talk about Ethan. He might be an even better fit." Fury raised an eyebrow. "Ethan? The guy everyone's calling the strongest man on Earth? If that's true, it explains why Hydra's been driven into hiding. The moment he appeared on the scene, they went underground. Now all they can manage are Shadow Network terror attacks." The two men exchanged a look. With Carol operating across the galaxy, and Tony, well, being Tony, it fell to the trio of veterans, Fury, Rogers, and now, potentially, Ethan, to corral these super talents and finally bring Hydra to heel. Ethan, he's too young and too trusting. Hydra could twist him around their finger in no time. Nick Fury glared across the briefing room. But despite Fury's vigilance, Steve Rogers remained unshaken. He'd chosen to hole up in the safe house S.H.I.E.L.D. had provided, recovering from his ordeal and slowly adapting to life in the modern world. Fury, unable to leave him entirely to his own devices, had planted a handful of agents to keep an eye on him and offer subtle guidance. People like Sam Wilson, the future Falcon. Steve, ever the Sentinel, spent his days glued to torn newspaper clippings and late-night TV bulletins, hunting every scrap of news on Hydra's latest terror plots. He hadn't yet mastered a computer, so print and broadcast were his only links to current events. Thank goodness, America still printed newspapers. One afternoon, as Steve flipped through another freshly delivered paper, Sam couldn't resist teasing him. "Really, Cap? You're living like a retired grandpa already?" Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his modest apartment several blocks away, thumbing through the Galvatron Gazette. The headline caught his eye: Captain America, frozen for 70 years, but still physically in his 20s, mentally in his 90s. The article explained that although Steve Rogers' body hadn't aged during his decades in the ice, the sheer weight of his experiences had added the wisdom and wariness of a man nearly a century old. Ethan chuckled at his own half-joking remark to Fury about Steve adopting a senior citizen lifestyle. He realized, though, how little he actually knew about the legend in that safe house. A boy thrust into the 21st century, a man carrying the burdens of wars he never aged through, and a hero still hunting the enemy who nearly destroyed him. Hydra didn't stand a chance, but Ethan suddenly understood why Fury was so determined to keep a watchful eye on him. Chapter 7. Ethan leaned back in his chair, one hand casually drumming on the desk. "We could take him out with a single punch," he said, his voice flat. "There's no real need to get the Illuminati involved." Across from him, Jingvatron, his boss, grinned, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Tony Stark had objected at first. The notion of dragging Steve Rogers into yet another clandestine scheme didn't sit well with him. Tony's antipathy towards Steve ran deep, a product of old grudges stoked by Howard Stark's well-meaning praise. But Ethan and Jingvatron had their reasons. "Trust me," Jingvatron said, amusement dancing in his eyes. "We'll give Steve just enough Hydra intel to keep him entertained. After all, we could all use a little fun." Ethan returned the smile, polite and measured. "Understood, boss." Jingvatron's laugh was low and mirthless, echoing in the dimly lit control room. He swiveled his chair toward the bank of monitors before him and pressed a button on the console. The screen flickered, then snapped into focus on an image of Steve Rogers finishing his daily workout. Steve's morning routine had become almost ritualistic. Super soldier serum or not, he still pushed himself hard, running laps, punching the heavy bag, practicing shield throws until his vision blurred. By the time he stepped into his apartment shower, he was spent. The steady hiss of warm water filled the small bathroom. Steve paused for a moment at the threshold, savoring the promise of relief. He undressed and stepped under the spray. Steam curled in the air, trailing down the tiled walls. A faint creak in the hallway snapped him fully alert. Then, before he could even towel off, there was a click, like a gun's safety being switched off. The door burst open. A tall figure dressed in black tactical gear loomed in the doorway, a large-caliber pistol raised. Bullets tore through the steam, pinging off the tiles with furious urgency. Bang! 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 The gunfire drowned out the roar of the shower. Steve didn't flinch. Water sluiced down his shoulders as he backed out of the stall, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he pivoted, dodging behind the shower wall in a single fluid motion. His shield lay within reach just on the other side. The shooter raised the gun for another shot. That was Steve's cue. He spun from cover, shield in hand, and slammed into the attacker with bone-shuddering force. The man jerked back, crashing into the wall and dropping his weapon. Steve's eyes were ice-cold as he wrenched the pistol free from the man's grip. He kicked it out of reach and pressed the butt of his shield against the assailant's chest. The man tumbled to the floor, breathless and defeated. "Who sent you?" Steve demanded, voice low and controlled. Up in the control room, Jingvatron tapped a finger on the armrest and leaned back. "So that was fun," he murmured to himself, eyes still glued to the monitor. "Let's see how he handles the next surprise." "Who are you?" Steve snapped, driving Ethan's arms behind his back in a vice-like grip and slamming him against the warehouse wall. His super soldier muscles coiled around Ethan in a lock no ordinary man could escape, yet Ethan twisted free without so much as a grunt. Steve's breath came heavy, but he didn't relent. In theory, no one could break his hold. For days he'd suspected Hydra was closing in, so he'd pushed his training until his lungs burned, determined never to be caught off guard. Now that he'd cornered his attacker, there was no way he would let him vanish into the night. They squared off in the dim light, and Steve immediately saw how ruthless Ethan's fighting style was. Bone-jarring strikes traded for scraps of advantage, flailing limbs that didn't care if they got cut or shattered. Each move was a perilous gamble, a take-it-or-die mentality that left fresh blood seeping through Ethan's torn sleeves. Steve grit his teeth and met every desperate blow with calm precision. His eyelashes barely fluttered as he anticipated Ethan's next move, an elbow aimed at the ribs, fingers darting for the throat. With one swift pivot, Steve disarmed the arm and swept Ethan's legs out from under him, knocking him to the concrete floor. Ethan gasped as the wind left his lungs, but even then he tried to spring back up, amber eyes blazing defiantly. Steve pressed a boot against Ethan's chest, pinning him face first on the cold slab. "Hydra?" Steve's voice was low but fierce. "Talk." He leaned in, every inch the super soldier, ready for answers, ready for whatever came next. Ethan's back was pressed against the cold metal wall as he glared at his opponent. Every time he closed in, the creature struck him down, only to lift itself up again, wounds already sealed. It was then that Ethan understood. This thing regenerated. No matter how deeply he cut it, it simply healed. Desperation rising, Ethan aimed at its head and pulled the trigger. The blast blew the creature's skull apart, but almost as quickly as the bone shattered, flesh and sinew knotted back together, and the monster stood, grin wide, shouting, "Long live Hydra!" "Damn it," Ethan muttered, unleashing a fresh burst of rounds. He riddled the creature's head until it nothing more than fragments on the floor. For a heartbeat, he thought he'd won, until the fragments wove themselves back into flesh, reforming bone, muscle, and blood. Ethan staggered backward, mind racing. He'd faced heavily armored foes before, ones he could eventually break down and finish. But an unkillable warrior? That was a whole different horror. Before he could gather his wits, his HUD let out a sharp beep. In the next instant, a shockwave slammed him through the adjoining wall, hurling him into darkness. He didn't dare look back. Chapter 152, Ethan's Awakening. A thunderous blast ripped through the night. Flames erupted, and a shockwave slammed into Ethan from behind. He hurtled at least 10 meters across the clearing before crashing to the ground. Instinctively, he curled into a protective ball, bracing himself against the heat and debris. When the dust settled, he dared to lift his head. His home lay in smoldering ruins. Charred timbers and blackened walls marked where he'd been living under his secret guardian's watch. Ethan's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a fierce, exhilarating clarity. He had never felt more alive. Hydra had come for him, and the fight had truly begun. Sirens wailed in the distance as a sleek shield transport skidded to a halt behind the wreckage. Nick Fury stepped out, flanked by a dozen agents. Fury's single cybernetic eye scanned the devastation, then locked on Ethan, who was rising to his feet, unbowed. "You okay?" Fury shouted over the faint crackle of dying flames. His usual calm facade was gone. He looked tense, angry. Ethan brushed soot from his jacket, his gaze steady. "I'm fine," he said. He glanced around, noting that several SHIELD agents who'd been assigned to monitor him were missing. "But they weren't just after me. Hydra's got men inside SHIELD." Fury's jaw tightened. "I suspected it," he muttered. He pulled out a comm unit. "Lock down all access points. I want every agent's clearance code cross-checked." Ethan nodded. He didn't need to be ordered to move. He stepped forward, crushing a smoldering plank underfoot. "They hit my house fast," he said. "They must have known exactly where I was living." Fury met his eyes, understanding the unspoken question. How had Hydra found him so quickly? Fury's expression was grim. "That's what we're about to find out." He motioned to his team. "Secure the perimeter. Ethan, get to the extraction point. We'll regroup at the safe house." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the surge of adrenaline in his veins. The world had changed in an instant, and so had he. Hydra wanted to break him. Instead, they'd awakened someone far more dangerous. As he followed Fury's agents into the night, Ethan vowed one thing: he would bring Hydra down, root and branch, and he would start tonight. Chapter 7. The Ghost in the Ranks. Ethan watched from the observation booth, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he witnessed the turmoil he'd orchestrated. All it took was a carefully planted clue to make Steve Rogers, and, more importantly, Nick Fury, question the purity of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now they'd chase ghosts of their own making. In the cavernous debriefing room, Fury leaned over the conference table, eyes hard. "If Hydra wanted you dead, why not send someone with powers? A super soldier, a pyrokinetic, anything but this." Steve Rogers ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, where a bruise was blossoming against his scalp. "They didn't send a powered operative. They sent an unkillable creature, strapped to a bomb." Fury's brow shot up. "Unkillable?" Steve met his gaze evenly. Took a 45 slug right between the eyes. Kept moving. Its muscle strength nearly matched mine, and the moment I hesitated because I thought it was dead, it would have detonated. Zero delay trigger. One wrong move, and we'd both be ashes. Judging by the blast radius, even steel-reinforced walls wouldn't have held. Fury slid back in his chair, replaying the grainy footage on the holoscreen. Steve's final strike, the creature's head flying apart, and its body rising again, right before the flash. "This reeks of inside knowledge," he murmured. "Whoever engineered that thing knew our protocols, our defenses, down to the last detail." Steve folded his arms, jaw clenched. "Exactly. They wanted us looking over our shoulders, questioning our own people. Now we're divided and distracted." Fury's eyes narrowed to slits. "Not for long. Ethan's gambit may have set us off balance, but it also hands us our prime suspect list. Let's find this mole in S.H.I.E.L.D. and exorcise the real ghost in the ranks." Steve nodded. As the doors sealed behind them, the two men vanished into the corridors, determined to root out betrayal and bring Ethan's shadow game to a screeching halt. "I've struck him in the heart and smashed his skull dozens of times," Steve said, still unsettled. "Even when I snapped his neck, he didn't stay down. He just got back up. Fury's remaining eye narrowed. The thought of Hydra fielding undead super soldiers was horrifying, but surely a bomb that powerful would finish even an immortal warrior. How can anyone survive that kind of devastation? And if he does, why would Hydra want him to die alongside you? Steve let out a bitter laugh. Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe they simply don't care. Fury's breath caught. He stared off into space, piecing together a chilling realization. They don't care. What if Hydra can churn out these undead fighters by the dozen? If one falls, another just takes his place. Steve's eyes went wide. That's impossible. An immortal body isn't something you mass-produce. If they could, Hydra would already have an army of them, and they'd be unstoppable. The briefing room was deathly quiet. Nick Fury sat behind the table, fingers steepled, his one remaining eye shadowed by the overhead light. No, he said at last, voice low. It's entirely possible. He closed his eyes. If that undead warrior really is immortal, Hydra won't let him go. They'll send him after Ethan, backed up by 10 superpowered agents, and Ethan won't stand a chance. Worse, they've likely wired that soldier with explosives. When it's time to detonate, they'll sacrifice him and take Ethan with him. Ethan leaned forward, arms crossed. You really believe they've figured out mass-producing the undead? Disposable zombie bombers? Fury's expression was grim. Think about it. Corpses reanimated, bulletproof and unfeeling, marching straight into our lines. Even if you could cut them down, you can't disarm 10 suicide bombers in time. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. I can hold my own one-on-one. My strength matches theirs, though they're a little slower. But super soldier strength plus true immortality, it's terrifying. Fury tapped a file icon on his tablet. Or maybe, just maybe, there's only one. Ethan shot him a skeptical look. One? You're telling me Hydra has a single, unkillable soldier locked away somewhere? It's possible, Fury said, and even one changes everything. Ethan stared at the polished table, the room's stale air suddenly suffocating. Hydra has entered a whole new era, he whispered. They sat in silence, each aware that the game had irrevocably shifted in Hydra's favor. Then we'll know if Hydra really dares send one of their immortal assassins after you again, Nick Fury said, his voice low and urgent. The only way to prove my theory is to wait and see if they deploy another undying operative. Steve frowned. Their last attempt failed spectacularly. They won't risk sending more killers so soon. Fury offered a thin, knowing smile. Exactly. That's why we need to lie low and let them make the first move. Steve let out a breath he'd been holding. Understood, but this place isn't safe anymore. Captain, you should leave with us. Fury inclined his head. He already knew that, but he wasn't about to reveal his full plan. Steve had nowhere else to turn, and the recent Hydra attack had once again dredged up all his old fears. With a reluctant salute, Steve fell in beside him. President Pierce, for his part, remained clueless that Hydra was taking the blame yet again. The so-called surveillance agents assigned to watch Steve were actually Hydra moles, passing every scrap of intelligence back to their handlers before vanishing without a trace. If Fury chose to follow that trail, it wouldn't take long to unmask the network. Elsewhere, Ethan stayed in the shadows. He made no overt moves. His role was to subtly steer events and observe the fallout. A soft chime broke the silence, and Michelle's holographic form flickered into view before him. Sir, Mr. Norman from Osborne Industries is requesting your attention. Ethan straightened. The real game was just beginning. Michelle stepped off the elevator into the Imperial Company's executive suite, the most convenient spot on the entire campus. She couldn't recall exactly how long it had been since she last saw her boss, Ethan, in person. Lately, he'd become almost hermit-like, preferring to conduct business through holographic projections and news feeds instead of face-to-face meetings. She gave a small nod to the receptionist. I know, she murmured, as though answering a question no one had asked. Inside his private office, Ethan glanced up from the digital briefing on his desk just as the valet ushered in his car. Earlier that morning, Galvatron had alerted him that Norman Osborn was on his way to the Imperial Company. Ethan had already anticipated Osborn's visit. The industrial magnate hoped to leverage Monarch Corporation's cutting-edge research to cure his family's hereditary disease. Now, all that remained was to see how far Osborn was willing to go and what he was willing to trade for a chance at a genetic breakthrough. Chapter 153, Seeking Help. Ethan sat alone in the dimly lit laboratory, the glow from a bank of computer monitors casting sharp shadows on the rows of medical journals and genetic reports strewn across his desk. For as long as anyone could remember, members of the Norman Osborn family had been cursed to die young. Their shortened lifespans weren't the result of violence or accident, but a hereditary retroviral disease, one that no conventional doctor had yet managed to cure. He rubbed his tired eyes and brought up the latest sequence data on the big screen. Retroviruses, by definition, carry their genetic material in the form of RNA. Once they invade a host cell, they use a special enzyme to convert their RNA into DNA and splice it into the cell's own genome. In most people, these viruses lie dormant or cause only mild chronic symptoms. In a few cases, they can trigger cancer. Over the course of evolution, countless retroviruses have woven themselves into our DNA, leaving behind relics of past infections. But the strain plaguing the Osborns was different. Aggressive, unrelenting, and lethal. Ethan scrolled through clinical notes. The Osborn virus drove unexpected changes in its hosts, thickening the skin's outer layer into a greenish cuticle that glimmered under sunlight and attacking neurons in the hands, which was why Harry Osborn and his father both suffered from involuntary tremors. Further down in the file, a geneticist's note stood out in red. Pathogenic mechanism, expanded CAG repeat encoding region. Patient repeat count far exceeds normal threshold. He leaned back and ran a hand through his hair. In healthy individuals, the CAG triplet, coding for the amino acid glutamine, repeats itself a handful of times in many genes. Here, however, the Osborn variant carried dozens or even hundreds of repeats. The runaway stretch of glutamines destabilized the protein's structure, setting off a cascade of cellular damage. The result: early onset of neurological decline, skin mutations, and ultimately organ failure. Ethan closed the file and exhaled. He had pieced together the mechanics of the disease, but understanding it was only the first step. Now he needed a cure, and for that he would have to ask for help. Pulling on his lab coat, he headed out into the night, determined to find anyone with the expertise and the courage to take on the deadly Osborn virus. Ethan sat quietly as Norman Osborn paced the length of his private study, mind racing faster with every step. Huntington's disease had always haunted the Osborn bloodline, each generation inheriting more CAG repeats than the last, and with them an ever earlier onset of symptoms. So when Harry began showing tremors at 16, Norman's composure snapped. Out of the blue, Emperor Company had offered an unexpected lifeline: cutting-edge human enhancement technology, an experimental super soldier serum, and most astonishingly, a newly celebrated AIDS therapy that was winning medical awards. To Norman, it was nothing short of miraculous. Could this so-called enhancement elixir be repurposed to correct Harry's genetic degeneration? But the serum was still unproven, and time was running out. Norman's voice faltered as he admitted his deepest fear. If they failed to halt Harry's decline soon, the Osborn lineage would collapse in no more than 3 generations. Originally, Norman said, his tone bitter, that AIDS treatment was designed to cripple Osborn Industries. But I don't care about the company rights now. All I want is to save my son. Watching from the doorway, Ethan allowed himself a single nod. He'd orchestrated this moment long ago, deploying assets, securing back-channel deals, and setting Galvatron in motion with military precision. The AIDS therapy was only one piece of a much larger plan, and Ethan intended to see it through to the end. Ethan paused to absorb what this meant. Emperor Industries had just achieved a cutting-edge breakthrough in retroviral proliferation, technology leagues ahead of its time. No wonder Osborn had been so tempted. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, wondering why he'd ever agreed to arrange this meeting. Well, whatever the reason, it had turned out to be an unexpectedly valuable experience. Stepping out of the lab, Ethan felt the weight of his recent power surge pressing down on him, yet at the same time he'd never been in better shape. His path to greater strength was astonishingly simple now. By exposing himself to ever harsher environments, his combat ability skyrocketed without limit. He didn't even need Cucumber as a sparring partner anymore. Cucumber simply couldn't keep pace with Ethan's rate of improvement. In every fight, Ethan found he could easily suppress his former rival. That extraordinary power sprang from an unprecedented fusion of legends. the might of a Super Saiyan, the inevitability of a perfect doomsday form, and the near invulnerability of a complete Kryptonian. Ethan had truly become the strongest life form in existence. For a moment, he considered challenging Odin, a duel that would show whether he could literally pin the All-Father to the earth. But Odin's divine power, though waning with age, still exceeded what Ethan's body could endure. Each time Odin faced serious injury, he simply retreated into an enchanted sleep to heal. Knowing he wasn't yet ready to withstand that level of divine backlash, Ethan set the idea aside, for now. For a moment, Norman Osborn's mind flickered with an impossible thought. If he ever faced Odin in combat, the Asgardian's power to summon or annihilate entire galaxies would make any human conflict seem trivial. But today's battle was much closer to home. Norman straightened his tie and stepped into the conference room. Across the polished glass table stood Dr. Ethan Adams, chief researcher at Monarch Biotech. Ethan offered a firm handshake and a welcoming nod. "Mr. Osborn, what can I do for you?" Norman returned the gesture. Almost immediately, he realized Ethan was nothing like the temperamental geniuses he'd dealt with before. Certainly not like Tony Stark. Here was a man calm, precise, and entirely professional. "Dr. Adams," Norman began, choosing his words carefully, "I'd like to propose a collaboration. Oscorp has developed a promising candidate for a broad-spectrum RNA antiviral. With Monarch's high-throughput screening facilities and regulatory expertise, we could accelerate it through clinical trials in record time." Ethan leaned back, his expression polite but guarded. Norman could almost see the gears turning behind those cool blue eyes. He pressed on. "My son Harry is already showing early symptoms. Once the disease takes hold, it's a countdown to organ failure. I need this cure yesterday." The mention of Harry stilled Ethan's reservations for a heartbeat, enough for Norman to sense he was close. He'd hoped to keep his ultimate bargaining chip hidden, the unfinished Green Goblin serum stored in his private vault, but now was not the time for half measures. Ethan folded his arms. "I'm sorry, Mr. Osborn. Monarch's research priorities have shifted away from antivirals. We're fully committed to our oncology and neurodegenerative programs for the foreseeable future." Norman's jaw clenched, but he nodded, committing Ethan's refusal to memory. Unbeknownst to the Monarch director, Oscorp still had plenty of cards left to play, and time was running out. Ethan's eyes never left the small vial on the bench. The transgenic mice had already demonstrated an almost unbelievable 8-fold increase in both strength and cognitive ability. Yet Ethan knew he could push the science even further if he had the right resources. Norman Osborn cleared his throat. "Ethan, what exactly do you need from Osborn Industries?" Ethan looked up and offered a faint smile. "Anything in your labs that could help me crack this RNA virus. Whatever it costs, I'll pay." Norman blinked. "Wait, you really mean anything? If I hand over a prototype compound or even some top-secret equipment, you can just take it?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. I'm not interested in corporate assets or patents, just a cure for this virus. That's worth any price to me." For a long moment, Norman was silent. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "All right, even if you want to dig through every drawer in Osborn Industries, I suppose I could agree. I'm young enough to start over if I have to. I've got the contacts to rebuild from scratch." He paused, studying Ethan's determined expression. "But I need to see evidence first. If you're serious, show me what you've got on this virus." Ethan thought for a second, then nodded. He'd already decided that saving Norman's family, especially young Harry, was a cause worth any sacrifice. With that resolve, he leaned forward and gestured. Norman reached into his briefcase and withdrew a slim folder. Inside lay Harry's medical reports alongside years of painstaking research notes on the mutant RNA virus coursing through the boy's bloodstream. He slid the folder across the table. "Here," Norman said quietly. "Take a look." Ethan leaned back in his chair, pretending to study the data on his tablet. After a long moment, he spoke softly. "This isn't an ordinary pathogen. It's an RNA-based genetic disorder." He tapped the screen for emphasis. "It runs in the Osborn family." Norman's face darkened. Now that the secret was out, there was no use hiding. He rubbed his temples and sighed. "All right, I'll begin my analysis right away. As for payment, we'll settle that once I have results." Ethan offered steadily, "I can help with the research. Norman forced a tight smile. Fine, I'll hold you to it. He paused, then added, but listen, I'm not naive. Once you have these findings, you could sit on them, let me and Harry fall ill, and then watch Osborne Industries' stock collapse. You'd profit from shorting our shares. I know that playbook all too well. Ethan's expression remained calm, betraying nothing. Norman met his gaze, warning clear in his tone. Don't give me a reason to regret trusting you. Silently, the two men understood the stakes. One side needed a cure, the other held the key. And in business, as in science, timing could be everything. Could you please provide the full chapter text that you'd like revised? Once I have the complete content, I'll rewrite it into a coherent, idiomatic English version, renaming Luther as Ethan and ensuring he's portrayed as male, while preserving all essential plot points and details. Chapter 154, I Want to Watch the World Burn. Norman felt no shame in laying his thoughts bare. Ethan didn't strike him as one of those so-called geniuses who know nothing. He met Ethan's steady gaze and said, Mr. Ethan, the hopes of the Osborne family rest on you. With that, Norman bowed and walked out of the gleaming Imperial Industries tower. Outside, he paused to watch the steady flow of executives and staff coming and going, an unspoken testament to ambition in motion. The sight tugged at his memories of starting from nothing, fighting tooth and nail to build his own legacy. Yet Ethan's talent far surpassed anything Norman himself had achieved. If his son Harry possessed just 1/10,000th of Ethan's ability, Norman could rest easy about the future. He sighed softly at the thought of Harry, an ordinary boy, disciplined and hard-working, never given to excess drinking or reckless spending. Harry's greatest asset, Norman reminded himself, was his friendship with Peter. Brilliant in his own right, Peter carried a drive and creativity that rivaled his peers, proof, Norman believed, that a child's destiny wasn't dictated by his parents' flaws. Peter's father might have been ensnared in unsavory business, but that had nothing to do with the boy's own talents. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plaza, Norman straightened his shoulders. With Ethan's unparalleled intellect and Peter's raw potential, the Osborne name was poised to blaze a trail unmatched in history. And Norman, at last, felt he could watch the world burn and be reborn in their hands. Despite Norman's well-meaning assurances, Ethan knew better than to believe that Osborne Industries could grow from a fledgling startup to a global powerhouse without ever resorting to questionable tactics. He didn't take Norman's protests seriously. If the situation hadn't already stunned the world or proven that Norman had been biding his time for this exact moment, Ethan might even have let him walk away with the data just then. After all, Ethan had never seen the Norman family's proprietary RNA virus before, so he hadn't devised a countermeasure in advance. But he did have Kryptonian, the most advanced artificial intelligence in the Dragon Ball world, where blowing up a galaxy is as effortless as breathing. In less than a femtosecond, Kryptonian decoded the virus's entire structure, and within moments of that analysis, Galvatron had already synthesized a bespoke antidote. Since Ethan's departure, Osborne Industries had transformed beyond recognition. Galvatron single-handedly upgraded the labs, built next-generation instruments, and streamlined every stage of production, no longer waiting on outside partners, not even in America, to catch up. It was absurd, Ethan thought, that with all the skills, the materials, and the technology at their disposal, anyone could still find themselves stymied or worse, undone, by obstacles that were supposed to be long behind them. Bruce Banner was slowly finding his footing in his new life at Stark Industrial Park. Tony Stark had poured more than $30 billion into a specially designed zone where the Hulk could operate safely and under control. Thanks to the truce Bruce struck with his alter ego, the Hulk now has a fixed hour each day to unleash his rage, leaving Bruce free the rest of the time, provided he doesn't find himself in mortal danger. This arrangement suited Bruce perfectly. With the Hulk's appearances neatly confined, he could finally explore the possibility of rekindling his relationship with Betty. And to show his gratitude to Tony Stark and Ethan, who'd both gone to great lengths to help him, Bruce threw himself into studying nanorobotics. He devoured everything he could on neural engineering and artificial intelligence. Of course, in the world of nanotech, no one could rival Dr. Otto's expertise. But Otto was firmly tied up with Osborn Industries and had no intention of defecting to Stark Industries, or to Imperial Corp for that matter. Pride, after all, keeps some doors closed. Now, with a clearer mind and a burgeoning new skill set, Bruce quietly prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, human or otherwise. Bruce Banner may not have whipped up a PhD in atomic physics overnight like Tony Stark claims to have done, but he's no less of a genius. With multiple doctorates under his belt, Banner jumps fields as easily as most people change socks. After all, in the Marvel Universe, crossing disciplines is practically a superpower. Mark 22 alloy, nanorobot composition, Banner said, eyes lighting up as he surveyed the gleaming suit laid out on the workbench. Across from him, Tony Stark looked every bit the mad scientist. Dark circles beneath his eyes, unkempt hair, and an air of barely contained excitement. Thanks to the experimental Compound 1 coursing through his veins, Stark now thrived on just an hour of deep sleep each day, but the toll showed anyway. Once in the original timeline, he'd stayed awake for days on end just to crack a stubborn technical problem. Now he seemed better able to endure those grueling sessions, but not without sacrifice. For countless iterations, and who knows how many sleepless nights, Banner and Stark had refined this design. Finally, they'd arrived at the perfect blend of nanorobotic steel. Banner tapped a control panel embedded in the gauntlet. It responds to neural commands, shifts into multiple configurations at will, he said with a satisfied grin, and thanks to the Veronica system, it can replenish any lost nanobots on the fly. Stark leaned in, fatigue momentarily forgotten. I'd call that a breakthrough. Bruce Banner adjusted his glasses. Unfortunately, we still haven't solved the assimilation problem. Otherwise, we could top up our nanobots on demand. That assimilation concept came from Ethan, Bruce added. It wasn't even on my radar until he brought it up. Tony Stark offered a polite nod, though his mind was elsewhere. He hadn't taken Ethan's proposal seriously at first. Handing over a full suite of nanobot designs and algorithms felt almost like an insult to Stark ingenuity. Who was this kid to spoon-feed him every technical detail? And yet, even without Ethan's data, the very outline of that approach pointed to a clear research path. Now Tony knew exactly how crucial it was and how fiendishly difficult. He was stuck on the one problem that mattered above all: how to split, replicate, and reintegrate the final generation nanorobots so they could self-replenish. Without that capability, their only fallback would be stock extra bots aboard Veronica for constant resupply missions, an inelegant solution at best. Tony straightened, determination hardening his voice. He wasn't about to let Ethan outshine him. If anyone was going to crack this, it would be him. Give me time, he said. I'll have a working prototype before you know it. Ethan's intentions were good. He didn't want Tony's new nano-armor to fall short of its potential, only to be torn apart by Thanos, just like in the original story. But it wasn't surprising that Tony's competitive streak flared up at the slightest provocation. A man's drive to outdo himself is a curious thing. Unbeknownst to most of the Illuminati, Tony had quietly begun work on an anti-Hulk suit to counter Bruce's alter ego. He wasn't plotting behind anyone's back out of malice. After all, the Illuminati existed to neutralize every threat to humanity. And with Hydra still holding Alexei Bronsky-Breznikov captive, an armament designed solely to curb the Hulk just wasn't enough. Ethan refused to sit idle. He believed that conflict was the crucible of innovation, and right now, neither Tony's nano-armor nor Bruce's gamma experiments had faced a true challenge. Who better to fill that role than Hydra? With Hydra in their sights, Ethan knew Tony and Bruce would push their inventions harder than ever. That very afternoon, as Tony and his team, Jarvis at the core, Spider-Man's dedicated monitoring program perched on a secondary console, were huddled over performance metrics for Mark II, an urgent alert lit up the main display. Monster attack in progress, Jarvis announced, pulling live feeds from the city police network. Hydra's moment had come. At last, the next generation of Tony's armor would be tested under fire. Chapter 155, Ace Pilot. Explosive overclocking. Tony Stark never did anything by halves. While Spider-Man was cautious, Tony charged in with brash confidence, and this time he dragged Ethan along for the ride. Together, they had hacked into every military and advanced satellite on the planet, from reconnaissance platforms to weather stations, and fused them into a single global network. They called it the Angel of Peace. Tony still didn't quite understand why Ethan had insisted on that serene name. If it were up to him, he'd have dubbed it the Sword of Damocles, a constant reminder that immense power always carries a threat. Even so, Tony had his own code. He'd rigged the network to respect civilian privacy. He wasn't out to play Big Brother. His real target was Hydra, using the Angel of Peace's omnipresent eyes to track down every secret lair, every hidden cell. Ethan had been surprised by the audacity of the plan, but then he'd hit Tony with an even wilder idea. "Why stop at existing satellites?" Ethan had asked. "Let's launch our own, private mini-satellites, hundreds of them, all under our control. Then we'll build a far more complete Angel of Peace, one no government could ever touch." As it stood, their Angel of Peace was little more than a proof of concept, a simple version cobbled together from military surplus. But Ethan swore the true network, the real Angel of Peace, would be something nobody had ever seen before. Tony's eyes gleamed at the thought, a private surveillance grid to rival any superpowers, and all in the name of peace. Thanks to Ethan's covert launch of his private satellite, codenamed Veronica, Tony Stark now had a real-time feed of the chaos unfolding in downtown Manhattan. On his holoscreen, a towering, bipedal creature, a nightmarish cross between man and dinosaur, was laying waste to everything in its path. "A monster attack detected. Perfect time to test our new gear," Tony muttered, fingers dancing over his console. He flipped open his comlink. "Bruce, Hulk, strap in. You're coming with me." There was a pause before Banner's voice crackled back. "You want me to go up against that thing?" "Absolutely," Tony said with a grin. "But take the flying wing unit that Ethan gave us. It'll keep you from getting pulverized." Banner hesitated as two massive propeller-driven ducts snapped onto the winglets of his suit. Each duct could tilt to vector thrust, turning the whole assembly into a single-soldier VTOL. It was cutting-edge technology, and Ethan had handed it over for free. Green energy flickered beneath Banner's skin as he cinched the last strap. "Ready," Banner growled softly. Moments later, the pair arrived above the disaster zone. Below them, police units had suffered heavy losses and were in full retreat. The dinosaur man stomped through armored vehicles like they were tin cans, roaring defiantly at the sky. "Hulk, hover there," Tony's voice crackled in Banner's earpiece. "You and Banner hold your position while I run the Mark II through its paces." Banner settled himself 50 feet above the carnage, legs dangling, the propellers humming. Down below, Tony Stark engaged his newest armor, preparing to plunge headlong into the fight and finally see what his latest creation could really do. Hulk and Banner had no objections. Although the Hulk was itching to get out there and prove himself, he trusted Tony and Ethan, so he followed orders without complaint. "Hey, big guy, did you escape from the zoo?" came Tony's teasing voice before Stark himself even appeared, echoing through the lab. The sound caught the attention of a hulking green figure nestled in the shadows, a lizard man, part dinosaur in stature, all reptile in features. He wasn't the product of Dr. Connor's experiments, at least not officially. The truth lay buried deeper in Osborn Industries' clandestine research. Kurt Connors had been developing a lizard serum, testing it on rodents with mixed results. Privately, Norman Osborn had greenlit human trials without Connors' knowledge. Every failure was quietly disposed of, their existence erased. Norman claimed he wanted to cure his family's genetic illness, not create lizard warriors. He'd convinced himself the military wouldn't be interested in these grotesque prototypes. Ironically, he was dead wrong. Any defense contractor would have jumped at the chance to weaponize them. Ethan watched from a safe distance as the lizard man slunk forward, nostrils flaring at the Hulk. Guilt knotted in Ethan's gut. He'd stumbled into this mess along with the others, but he hadn't created it. Now, facing the unintended consequences of Osborn's ambition, he resolved to set things right, no matter what it took. Ethan watched with cold satisfaction as Galvatron overrode every safety lock in the Osborn Industrial Lab. Following Ethan's instructions, the massive mech arm calibrated the injection device and spiked the standard lizard serum formula with just a few grams of rare trace elements. The extra additives wouldn't kill him, but they would push his mutation far beyond normal limits. granting him near invulnerability to blades and bullets, immeasurable strength, an effectively immortal body, and a regenerative capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. The moment Galvatron administered the altered serum, Ethan's transformation began. His bones cracked and reshaped themselves, muscles ballooned beneath rippling scales, and his height shot upward until he stood nearly 2 meters tall. Galvatron didn't stop there. With a few deft commands, he dispatched a swarm of microdrones to paralyze the fire suppression system, disabling alarms and deactivating the sprinklers, then ignited a blaze that quickly swept through the lab. The flames roared to life, devouring research files, equipment, and any trace of the clandestine experiments. As the inferno raged, Osborn's security teams burst in, weapons drawn, but they were no match for Ethan's new form. His bloodthirsty animal instincts, amplified by the serum's brutality, took over completely. Rational dialogue was impossible. At Tony's signal, "Go!" Ethan launched himself skyward and dove into the fray. With a single earth-shaking impact, he scattered guards like bowling pins, their bullets bouncing harmlessly off his armored hide. In moments, the hallway was silent, save for crackling flames and the distant wail of sirens. With the laboratory and its occupants neutralized and every scrap of evidence consumed by fire, Ethan stood amid the smoke and ruin. Galvatron hovered beside him, its optics scanning the destruction. "Operation complete," the mech intoned. Ethan flexed his massive claws, tasting ash on his tongue, and felt for the first time the limitless potential that rage and mutation could unlock. Behind them, the firestorm continued to roar, ensuring that no one would ever know the true extent of what had happened here. If Tony Stark hadn't already faced the Hulk and the Abomination, he probably would have frozen in shock. Instead, in a single heartbeat, he clenched his jaw, throttled back the adrenaline surge, and let his mind settle into an uncanny stillness. He called it overclocking mode, a self-taught mental state that pushed human cognition beyond its usual ceiling. Scientists had long speculated about overclocking the human brain, but without hard data or safe methods, the theory went nowhere. That changed when Ethan sold Stark Industries the formula for compound number 1. Ostensibly, it granted enhanced reflexes and faster neural responses, but Tony's relentless tinkering revealed something far more profound. While every other test subject achieved only the baseline effects, Stark's work on the serum was verging on what one might call compound number 2 territory. Ethan watched from a distance, stirring with regret. He'd agreed to a $10 million deal, thinking he'd extracted every last cent's worth from his breakthrough. He never imagined Tony would unearth this hidden potential, far beyond what any normal user could summon. Now Ethan wondered if he'd been too generous. Should he complete the next iteration, only to hand over even greater power to Stark Industries? On the battlefield below, the Hulk roared, charging headlong at the Abomination. Glass shattered, alarms wailed, and panicked crowds streamed for cover. Stark stood his ground, eyes narrowed behind his mask. In that moment, every synapse in his brain snapped to attention, operating at 3 times its normal speed. Overclocking mode engaged. Tony was ready to prove just how deep compound number 1's rabbit hole went. And by the time the dust settled, the world would understand that Marvel's mutations were only the beginning. Ethan pushed his suit into overclocking mode, every sensor blazing with data, yet his mind remaining unnervingly calm. He was the ace pilot now. As the giant green lizard lunged, firing its spiked tail like a projectile, Ethan slid sideways in what looked like slow motion, narrowly evading the attack. Before the creature could recover, Ethan raised his gauntleted hand and unleashed a concentrated palm energy blast straight into its abdomen. The force shattered through the monster's thick scales, far more devastating than the lizard had ever anticipated. It staggered back, but its remarkable regenerative ability stitched its wounds almost instantly. No sooner had it healed than it reared its head and spewed a steaming jet of liquid at Ethan. Jarvis's voice rang softly in his helmet. "Sir, I'm detecting a chemical reaction in that fluid. The air composition indicates a high-strength acidic etchant." Overclocked Jarvis streamed the analysis at lightning speed, and Ethan absorbed it in an instant. He tightened his stance, ready to respond with the optimal countermeasure, because in this overdrive state, every fraction of a second counted. Although Ethan trusted the Mark 22's defensive strength, he'd never given its corrosion resistance a second thought. He made a mental note to address that oversight as soon as he returned. Chapter 156, The Hydra Strikes Back. When Tony Stark darted clear of the creature's corrosive spray, the green lizard spun on its heel, gouged through the crumbling concrete floor, and vanished into the sewer below. Without hesitating, Tony leapt after it. No sooner had he landed on the slick tunnel floor than the beast sprang from the shadows, its razor-sharp claws slicing through the air to tear into him. Screech! Metal scraped against hardened scales in a screeching clash that echoed off the brick walls. Luckily, Tony's nanosuit held firm. At his slightest command, thousands of microscopic cones erupted across its surface, forming a spiked shield that halted the lizard's talons just millimeters from his skin. The outer shell dented only slightly before the suit's high-strength nano-elastomer rebounded the claws away like rubber. This was the very armor Tony and Bruce Banner had refined and stress-tested tens of thousands of times. Far superior to any old steel exoskeleton, it could absorb crushing blows, deflect cutting strikes, and withstand brutal pressure. Even a direct hit from the Hulk's fist would leave it unscathed. Tony tapped his visor controls. It was time to fight back. Aside from lacking the Chitauri's transformation technology, this nanosuit already outclassed Tony's best armor in almost every other respect. When his sneak attack failed, the Hulk-like creature merely ricocheted away. Tony Stark was not someone you messed with. In an instant, his neurons fired command signals to the nanobots woven through his suit, ordering a rapid reconfiguration. Down here in the sewers, even one as vast as America's, he couldn't risk using high-heat weaponry. "Hulk mode," Tony announced, a smirk playing on his lips. The nanobots beneath his skin swelled rapidly. They secreted a non-Newtonian fluid that fused into dense, armor-like plates. Within seconds, Tony's frame ballooned into a towering figure nearly the same size as the green powerhouse before him. This hulking form was one of several configurations developed by Ethan, and upon seeing its devastating potential, Tony didn't hesitate to activate it. Of course, besides Hulk mode, the suit also featured an Ethan mode, though it still wasn't quite as fearsome as the Hellbat armor. Ethan stood his ground in the dim glow of the underground complex, arms folded across his armored chest. "Stark, you're not touching my suit's configuration," he said quietly. "And I'm not giving you the Hellbat armor. I built it for myself, not to babysit you." Tony rolled his eyes. "Please, I only mentioned the Hellbat concept to spark your creativity. If I wanted one, I'd design my own." They traded barbs until a guttural roar echoed down the corridor. A hulking green reptilian humanoid burst into view, scales gleaming under the flickering lights. Before Ethan or Tony could react, the creature charged. Tony leapt forward, repulsors igniting in his palms. One thunderous punch drove the beast headfirst into the reinforced tunnel wall. The impact rattled the stone, tilting the creature's head nearly 180 degrees. Though, incredibly, it remained attached. "Stark," a voice called from the shadows. Tony spun. Emerging from the gloom was a broad-shouldered figure he knew all too well. "Emil Blonsky?" Blonsky's sardonic grin stiffened into a snarl of pure contempt. "Hydra's got dibs on this lizard man, Stark. Back off." He cracked his knuckles with bone-jarring pops. "Let's see if your fancy suit can stop me." Tony dashed for his belt console. "Jarvis, get Banner on comms, now." "Connection jammed, sir," Jarvis replied instantly. "External signals are being blocked." Above ground, Bruce Banner frowned at his earpiece. "Tony, come in." He tapped the device, but only static answered him. Banner ran a hand through his hair, worry tightening his features. The lizard mutation was dangerous, but if Stark was cut off mid-fight, something far worse was at play. Below, Tony squared off against Blonsky, repulsors at the ready, and Ethan braced himself for the fight to come. Ethan knew all too well just how powerful the nano-armor he and Tony Stark had engineered could be. As Bruce Banner moved to scan the readings on his tablet, a massive figure suddenly filled the doorway. Towering nearly 8 feet tall and built like a mountain, the man wore a scarlet helmet, shaped almost like an upturned pot lid, and a matching vest emblazoned with the Hydra emblem. The sight alone was enough to unnerve anyone. The man's physique was colossal, easily tipping the scales over 500 pounds of rippling muscle. Yet there was something almost gleeful in his stance, as if daring Banner to blink first. "Green Hulk?" he rumbled, his voice low as thunder. "I'm Hydra's red tank. Heard you're fond of brawling." Banner's gaze flicked to Ethan, then hardened. Hydra. Since joining the Illuminati, Bruce had learned everything there was to know about the shadowy terrorist network. Neutralizing Hydra was their top priority, but it was a task that had proven bafflingly difficult. Even with Ethan, the world's strongest man, on their side, their intelligence arm, the so-called Angels of Peace, had come up empty, unable to uncover a single solid lead on Hydra's next move. Ethan shifted, readying himself inside the sleek confines of his nano-armor. "We'll see about that," he said, voice calm but steel-edged. And with the faint hum of his suit's power plant spinning up, the two heroes braced for the onslaught that would decide who really held the upper hand, Ethan in his cutting-edge armor, or Hydra's unstoppable red tank. Chapter 7. The Unstoppable Force. Ethan stood tense in the observation chamber, watching Angel of Peace hover motionless over the reinforced cell's barrier. Neither Angel nor the guards had sensed what was coming next. Then, without warning, the reinforced blast doors shattered inward with a thunderous crash. A hulking figure, bathed in crimson light, strode through the wreckage. He was nearly twice as tall as a man, his muscles bulging beneath gleaming red armor. In a voice like rolling thunder, he barked, "Open the cage and let the Hulk out, you weakling." Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't a mutant rampaging through the halls. This was something else entirely. He recognized the legend. Cain Mark, better known as Red Tank. Myth said his power sprang not from genes but from dark magic, credited to the evil god Sitorak himself. Long ago, Sitorak forged a blood-red ruby, imbuing it with limitless arcane energy. Any mortal foolish enough to grasp the gem would find that energy coursing through their veins, transforming them into a juggernaut, the Red Tank. That magic granted Cain near invulnerability and superhuman strength, so immense it carved city blocks in two. Stories told of him shrugging off Mjolnir's blows and tearing through Wolverine's adamantium claws as though they were butter knives. Now that the ruby had awakened within him again, Cain's power was boundless. He needed only to choose a direction, and nothing short of a reality-warping spell or a scientific miracle could halt his momentum. Ethan swallowed hard. If Red Tank demanded to release the Hulk, it meant someone intended to pit two unstoppable forces against each other. And if Ethan didn't act fast, the ensuing clash would obliterate this entire facility and anyone caught inside. Steeling himself, Ethan drew a deep breath and stepped forward. Red Tank's crimson eyes locked onto him, and the chamber seemed to shrink under that gaze. But if there was one thing Ethan had learned in the X, the Brotherhood and beyond, it was that even the most relentless juggernaut could be outmaneuvered. "Stand down," Ethan called aloud, voice echoing against fractured concrete. "No one's letting the Hulk out. Not today." Red Tank's lips curled in amusement. Or was it fury? Ethan couldn't tell. All he knew was that if he failed to stop Cain before the gates slid open, this showdown would leave nothing but ruin in its wake, and Ethan would do whatever it took to prevent that. Because some battles could not be allowed to start. And some adversaries, no matter how unstoppable, had a breaking point. Ethan had always wondered whether the larger-than-life heroes and villains he read about actually existed. Figures like the self-imprisoned Sentinel wielding the power of 1,000,000 stellar explosions, Blue Surprise, Hyperion, and the rest. So when he caught wind of Red Tank in the field, he seized the chance. Adopting the guise of Black Caesar, he confronted his foe head-on. Within moments, Ethan's superior telepathic abilities overwhelmed Red Tank. He crushed him in combat, then toyed mercilessly with his mind until the hulking brute conceded defeat. Humiliated by the loss, forced to snatch scraps from stray dogs and urinate in the street, Red Tank now trembled at even the mention of Black Caesar. His fear left him no choice but to pledge himself to Hydra. That very day, Black Caesar dispatched Red Tank to stall the Green Hulk, while Bronski would capture the Lizard Man and attempt to eliminate Tony on his own. Despite underestimating the Lizard Men's strength, both Bronski and Red Tank obeyed without question. Chapter 157, Bronski's Outburst. "That's my partner Ethan up there, paying Dr. Banner a little visit," Bronski growled, his eyes fixed on the hulking green form racing toward the battlefield. Tony Stark and Bronsky faced off amid the chaos. Bronsky cracked a cold smile. "Tell me, Stark, do your pet projects really think they can take on the Hulk?" Tony paused, heart hammering. If Hydra could field an operative who might hold the Hulk at bay, what other surprises did they have stowed away? He had bigger worries than Dr. Banner's rampage. On the edge of the fray, the Lizard seized his chance and darted for cover, only to be seized by the Obsidian Sentinel. "Where do you think you're going?" the Sentinel rumbled. His obsidian black fist slammed into the Lizard, sending him sprawling in a tangle of claws and scales. It wasn't the most powerful punch Stark had ever seen, but it was more than enough to qualify its wielder as Hydra's new heavy. The Sentinel loomed over the groaning reptile. "Is that your backup? Which clandestine lab did he crawl out of?" Stark's eyebrows shot up. He'd never encountered this Obsidian Sentinel before. He tapped the side of his armor, silently recording the Sentinel's power signature and armor configuration. Then, leaning toward Bronsky, he whispered, "Who is he? He's new to Hydra, right?" Bronsky shrugged off the question and adjusted his battle-worn collar. He'd been on more battlefields than he cared to remember, always the straightforward soldier rather than a scheming politician. Yet here he was, playing along with Stark's pointed curiosity. Tony reflected that in all their years of crossing paths, he'd never expected Bronsky to roll over for such an obvious ploy. It had been too long since they'd last tangled. Now the real question was, what came next? Inside Hydra's underground arena, Tony Stark rose to his feet, shaken but far from beaten. His new armor gleamed in the harsh lights, its surface smooth and springy, like a colossal steel basketball ready to rebound any blow. Bronsky, seething with rage, summoned his bone spur attack and thrust both arms forward, but the spurs simply skidded across Tony's suit, glancing off like pebbles on a bulletproof shield. Bronsky overbalanced and crashed to his knees, unable to channel any force into his strike. That split second was all Tony needed. He pumped his fist in rapid succession, each blow driving through Bronsky's cheekbones. The bone spurs protruding from Bronsky's face shattered one by one, hissing like snapped twigs under jackhammer pressure. Bronsky staggered, disbelief and fury etched across his wounded features. Watching from the command cradle of the newcomer, codenamed Red Tank, Ethan clenched his jaw. Until recently, he and Bronsky had shared the number 3 slot in Hydra, second only to Black Caesar and Obsidian. But with Tony's exceptional power on the field and the arrival of Ethan's own armored powerhouse, both Obsidian and Bronsky had been pushed down the hierarchy. Now neither one was a match for the Red Tank, nor for Ethan himself. Bronsky spat blood onto the concrete floor and roared, "You think you can make a mockery of me? I'll crush you for this!" With a twisted grin, he reinflated the bone spurs along his forearms, each tip jagged and wickedly sharpened. Before Bronsky could lunge again, Ethan keyed the Red Tank's targeting console. A low hum built behind them, then a blinding discharge of energy ripped from the mass driver railgun mounted on the suit's shoulder. The beam struck Bronsky squarely in the chest, sending him flying backward like a rag doll. Dust and debris showered the arena, and when it cleared, Bronsky lay motionless, utterly defeated. Ethan allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Tonight, he had reclaimed his place and proven exactly why no one in Hydra would dare challenge the Red Tank again. Ethan watched as Bronsky, Hydra's new enforcer, cracked his knuckles, eyes cold with approval. Hydra settled disputes with blood and bone, never bothering with rank or protocol, and Bronsky loved it. But that's precisely what unnerved Ethan. No matter how fiercely Bronsky fought, he still couldn't claim the top spot. For a man whose pride lay in his fists, it was a devastating blow. Seething with frustration, Bronsky's body became a crucible for every experimental compound coursing through his veins. Compound number 1, the old super soldier serum, even traces of Hulk serum. In the Marvel world, these serums are famously unstable under emotional stress. Only Luke Cage stood as a known exception. Bronsky should have been finished. He was already crippled beyond repair. Ethan had even toyed with the idea of injecting him with Green Goblin or Lizard serums, or maybe the Extremis virus, just to see how far he could go. But before any of that could happen, Bronsky mutated again, all on his own. Compound number 1 was the only wild card, and it had clearly triggered this second transformation. Tony Stark's gaze snapped to Bronsky as jagged, bone-like spurs burst from his skin, glowing an ominous green. Worry creased Tony's face. If the glow meant radiation, they were in real danger. He stumbled back and barked, "Jarvis, full-spectrum scan, now!" The lab fell into a tense hush as the AI's sensors whirred to life, everyone holding their breath for the results. "Jarvis, scan for radiation." "Sir, all readings are normal," the AI replied almost instantly. Tony Stark studied the hulking figure before him. Ethan's skin, or whatever passed for skin, was streaked with glowing, fluorescent green spines, bone protrusions that pulsed with energy. Tony frowned. So he's just glowing? No sooner had the words left his mouth than he felt it too, a deep, thrumming power emanating from Ethan's entire body. "I don't know what's lighting him up," Tony said into his comlink, "but I can feel it." Ethan flexed, each movement sending bright green veins snaking across his massive arms. He let out a low, feral laugh. "You really think that tin can stop me?" Tony shrugged, raising his repulsors. "It's not Christmas yet. No one's getting you any presents, big guy." He fired a quick burst of energy at Ethan's chest. Instead of staggering back, Ethan charged through the blast. In the next heartbeat, his fist rocketed forward and connected with Tony's helmet. Inside the suit, Tony's vision wavered as the impact rattled every sensor. He saw the punch coming, but there was nowhere left to duck. Bronsky's fist came out of nowhere, smashing into Tony's helmet with bone-shaking force. Even as Tony staggered backward, Bronsky drove his punch deeper, as if he intended to rip through every inch of the armor. The HUD warned relentlessly, suit integrity at 99%, 97%, 95%. Tony had no choice but to fire every thruster in his armor. With a roar of repulsors, he pivoted mid-air, slamming Bronsky into the crumbling ceiling of the abandoned sewer. Chunks of concrete and rusted rebar showered down around them. Momentum carried Blonsky with him, and for just a moment it looked like he'd been thrown clear, until he yanked on Tony's leg, wrenching himself back toward the armored Avenger's flight path. Jarvis alerted, "Sir, structural damage at 3% and rising." Tony gritted his teeth. He still needed to reach Bruce Banner, and fast. With a surge of energy, he veered out of the tunnel and ascended toward street level. The sirens and distant screams told him the city was in chaos, but he had his target. Then, high above the wreckage of a shattered storefront, Tony finally spotted them. The Hulk, towering, green, and furious, locked in battle with something he'd never seen before. The opposing figure was vast, its skin an angry shade of crimson, every blow echoing like thunder. Glass and steel twisted into ribbons under the impact. "What the hell is that?" Tony muttered to himself. Hydra had experimented on Blonsky, sure, but this opponent was on another level. Hovering above the fray, Tony steeled himself. No matter how monstrous the enemy, he wasn't going to let Banner or the city down. He flipped his mask down, activated full combat mode, and dove into the fight. Except for Ethan, this was the first time Tony had ever seen anyone go toe-to-toe with the Hulk. Bronsky didn't count. He'd been taken down by Ethan before he even got close enough to throw a punch. Still, seeing Tony's armor neutralized so effortlessly was unnerving. With a soft hissing click, Tony's nanotech suit dissolved around him, snapping apart Bronsky's metal restraints in an instant. "Jarvis, I need every spare nanobot you've got. Now!" Tony barked. "Right away, sir," the AI replied. High above them, Veronica, stationed in Earth orbit, launched a cargo pod loaded with replacement nanobots. It hurtled toward Tony's coordinates at terminal velocity. On the ground, Bronsky watched Tony streak across the sky. He ripped a parked car from the street and hurled it upward like a javelin. Tony twisted mid-air and caught the car by its bumper, bringing it to a graceful halt as if it weighed nothing. Still sprawling on the pavement below, Bronsky glared up. "Where the hell is Ethan?" Tony muttered, raising the car as a makeshift shield. He tapped his earpiece, but the comms were dead, jammed. With this much chaos, Ethan should have known to show up. Tony fumed, trying again. Static. Then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Relax, Stark. I'm not rushing in to save your ass. I kind of want to see you embarrass yourself first." And with that, the line went dead. Tony clenched his jaw and leapt back into the fray, determined to hold his ground until Ethan finally decided to join the fight. Chapter 158, The Emperor Arrives. "Sir, Hydra may be drawing Ethan's attention," Jarvis reported in Tony's earpiece. Tony paused. It's not impossible. Hydra had managed to field a team capable of holding the Green Hulk at bay, so it stood to reason they could distract Ethan too. If Ethan left New York, they'd be in serious trouble. A deafening roar cut through Tony's thoughts. Hulk! Below, the Green Hulk charged the red tank. Each thunderous step from the armored giant shoved Hulk backward, inch by inch. Is that all you've got? Red Tank shouted with a triumphant grin. Around the city's ruins, he felt his confidence surge. Apart from the invincible Hydra overlord Black Caesar, he was the second strongest weapon on the planet. Emil Blonsky, the Green Hulk, even Obsidian, they were no match for him. Then a voice whispered in his mind, Red Tank, the mission's complete. You may extract. Extract? He sneered. No, I want them to understand the true terror of Hydra. He recognized the transmission. Hydra's phone, a jammable-proof telepathic link for elite operatives. But who was on the other end commanding him now? How could Red Tank be pulling back so easily? We'd barely even begun. I watched it slide away from the hulking green figure we still needed to take down. My phone buzzed again, and a cold, synthetic voice announced, Commander Ethan, the Emperor is approaching. No, if you value your life, withdraw immediately. I sketched a frown at the screen. What Emperor? Red Tank's cannon rumbled beside me like a roaring beast. The Emperor Ethan, the very name that makes Black Caesar tremble, it growled. Do you think I'm here just to pilot a ship? No, I'm here to fight. A guttural roar split the air. Green Hulk charged, veins pulsing under his emerald skin, fists pounding the deck's plating. Hulk is strongest, he bellowed. With each blow, his already massive frame swelled by another third. Fury was his fuel, amplifying his speed, boosting his defenses, bulking up his muscles. In the comics, that rage can balloon him to skyscraper size or beyond. The movies seldom dare show him that big. Even so, this partial transformation set Red Tank's reinforced armor screaming under the impact. Yet the tank did not falter. Its treads bit deeper into the decking, its barrels still leveled squarely at Hulk's chest. No matter how gamma-charged his punches became, Red Tank simply powered forward, unstoppable. Every bone-shaking strike only pushed the battle closer to the edge, far closer than I ever imagined. The Red Tank shuddered to a halt, its massive treads kicking up dust. Seizing the moment, Ethan drove the Green Hulk forward and slammed his reinforced forehead right into the tank's command turret. The impact sent the Red Tank staggering backward 2 full paces. Before its pilot could regroup, the Green Hulk's armored fists began to pummel the enemy's head and chest in a relentless flurry. Each blow detonated in concussive shockwaves. Anyone standing too close would have had their eardrums shattered. A nearby car was no match for the onslaught. It flipped over and skidded across the pavement like a toy. Red Tank's pilot, outraged, countered with a savage uppercut to the Green Hulk's chin. The blow launched Ethan's machine skyward. For an instant, the Green Hulk hung in midair before crashing back down, metal screeching as it skid across the ground. Sensing victory, the Red Tank marched forward and planted its tread onto the Green Hulk's knee joint, grinding the armored leg into the asphalt. Get up! The Red Tank's pilot snarled through his comm, stomping down with full weight. Pain flared through the Green Hulk's hydraulics, but Ethan refused to yield. With a guttural roar, he locked onto the Red Tank's shoulders, braced himself, and heaved the rival machine off balance, then hurled it across the battlefield. Chunks of debris flew as the Red Tank skidded to a halt, wheels spinning uselessly in the dust. Both mechs paused, smoke rising from battered armor plates. No fancy maneuvers, no calculated techniques, just 2 iron behemoths locked in a raw, brutal brawl. And as the ring of silence settled for a heartbeat, Ethan's Green Hulk readied itself for the next strike. Ethan hovered in midair for a long moment, arms folded, watching the chaos below. Normally, the Hulk's raw power was enough to handle any opponent, but unchecked rage had cost him the finesse he once learned in hand-to-hand combat. Ethan shook his head. I'll have to spar with him more often, he muttered. Get him back to feeling those boxing angles so Thanos can't floor him in 2 blows. With that, he dropped down onto the platform. At once, Tony Stark's face lit up. Ethan, you're late to the Illuminati's first team-building exercise. Sorry, Ethan said, forcing a smile as his boots touched down. Air traffic congestion. No sooner had he landed than a hulking red-armored assassin, known only as Red Tank, broke off his skirmish with the Hulk and darted past Ethan toward the far edge of the arena. Enraged, the Hulk bellowed, "That insubordinate killer needs discipline," and gave chase. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Red Tank's refusal to fall back had stalled the Emperor's arrival. Bronski's earlier standfast was forgivable, but this was another matter entirely. In the blink of an eye, Ethan was in front of the mercenary, feet planted solidly on cracked concrete. Red Tank skidded to a halt, momentarily stunned by Ethan's sudden appearance, precisely the instantaneous strike Ethan had aimed for. He looked around, bewildered, as though Ethan had been there the whole time. "Looks like you're out of moves," Ethan said quietly, stretching a hand toward the astonished assassin. "Now about that lesson in obedience." Ethan's fist drove deep into Blonsky's midsection, and the crimson-skinned giant grunted in pain. He stumbled backward, hands pressed to his gut, before dropping to his knees. Ethan studied him. He looked every bit like the fully evolved Hulk from Waterline, fluorescent green bone spurs glowing across his body, yet the raw hate in his eyes remained unchanged. Blonsky had never been shy about charging in headlong. Now he was tougher than ever, strong enough that even Tony Stark had stopped meeting him face to face and chose to keep his distance. But when they locked eyes, Blonsky's confidence wavered. Before he could decide what to do next, Ethan materialized at his side and slammed another punch into the same spot. A fist-shaped imprint blossomed on his back. Blonsky rolled his eyes. "I knew it," he rasped, then collapsed onto the ground. Ethan's biological force field ensured he could never be knocked unconscious, but these brutes were thick-skinned. It would take many more hits before they truly felt the sting of defeat. Ethan tightened his focus and unleashed the bioforce field, wrapping Red Tank in a shimmering, semi-organic shell. The containment held the mech rigid, forcing it to absorb every ounce of his incoming blow. When his fist connected, the impact detonated like a small earthquake, yet, to Ethan's surprise, Red Tank refused to collapse. Sparks flew from its servos as it staggered upright. "Emperor Ethan!" The machine boomed, defiance crackling in its voice. With renewed fury, Red Tank charged. Each of its steps detonated the ground beneath it, as if anti-tank mines were buried under every cobblestone. The earth fractured, gravel rained skyward, and thunderous booms echoed down the street. Ethan watched, waiting for the right moment. He raised his unshielded hand. Golden light gathered in his palm, coalescing into a brilliant sphere of pure energy. In a heartbeat, he launched it. The blast slammed into Red Tank's chest, flattening the surrounding asphalt in a concentric shockwave. Metal groaned, hydraulics seized, and then the red mech ground to a halt, smoke curling from its joints. "Sir, that was a massive reaction," Tony's voice crackled over Ethan's comlink. "The inductive element in our diagnostic nanorobot just fried trying to measure the output." Jarvis added, "All onboard energy sensors have been burned out. The instantaneous energy spike exceeded laboratory thresholds by an undetermined multiple. We'll need access to large-scale testing equipment to analyze the data." Ethan lowered his hand, the last glimmers of golden light fading away. He surveyed the disabled Red Tank and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Looks like our field test isn't quite routine," he said quietly. "Time to dig deeper into what just happened." Chapter 159, Cruel Punishment. The roar of the explosion faded, and the massive red-powered suit tumbled from the sky, crashing into the earth with a thunderous impact. Dust and debris filled the air, hiding any sign of life inside that armored behemoth. Ethan knelt at the edge of the crater, peering into the smoke. "We can't hand them over to the military or S-Shield," he said, voice low but urgent. "Hydra will come crawling back for Bronsky and that armor. They're worth far more to them than that lizard creature. We need to imprison them ourselves and extract every last bit of intel on Hydra's plans." Tony Stark stood a few feet away, hands on hips, staring at the smoking crater. "I've never seen a strike like yours, Ethan. It was, honestly, more terrifying than my arc reactor's full output." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "You're like a walking nuclear reactor." Ethan gave him a wry smile. "Flattery from you, Tony, is worth exactly half a Stark invention. But he's right, Hydra isn't giving up. Not Bronsky, not the Red Tank. We have to build a cell that can hold them both. No extraordinary power, no matter how destructive, can break out of that." Tony nodded slowly. I still think we should call in the Illuminati to deal with them. These two are too dangerous to keep around. A low growl rumbled through the clearing. The Hulk, towering green and furious, stared at the downed armor, muscles coiled like springs. He took a step forward, chest heaving, but then his expression softened. With a guttural sigh, he turned and walked away. As the green hue receded, Bruce Banner re-emerged, wiping soot from his brow. Ethan watched him go, then turned to Tony. I didn't expect him to listen so readily, Tony admitted, almost in wonder. He's a good boy, Ethan said quietly, watching Banner retreat into the trees. And right now, we need a bit of obedience. Tony cracked a grin. All right then, let's get to work on that prison. Between the two of them, a plan was already forming, one that would contain Hydra's strongest assets and, they hoped, pry loose the secrets buried within. S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and military personnel swept in within minutes, sealing off the compound. The Army had already called in a heavy-lift transport plane to haul away the Red Tank and Emil Blonsky. This time, they were determined Hydra wouldn't get their hands on either prize. A Hydra operative screeched, "Impossible! That's our trophy! You have no right to interfere!" But Tony Stark stepped between the two forces, holding up a hand. His voice was calm but firm. "I'm Tony Stark. This is American soil. Our rules apply here." He didn't flinch as both soldiers and agents hesitated. The general in charge, his uniform decorated with medals, snorted in Tony's direction. "All due respect, Stark. Maybe you and your friend should consider relocating Stark Industries and Imperial Industries overseas." "What's your take on that, Ethan?" Ethan, formerly known as Luther, exchanged a quick look with Tony before replying. "Moving our research out of the States? I've actually run some tests on an ecosystem converter I've been developing. It can terraform large areas, say stretch of desert, and support agriculture, even moderate rainfall." The general's jaw tightened. He knew neither Stark nor Ethan would abandon their American operations, but the suggestion alone might give rival factions pause. For the moment, that was enough to maintain the fragile balance at the site and keep Hydra at bay. "General, I understand private prisons are everywhere, and frankly, I'd rather not get involved, but we have to comply with federal regulations." The general shrugged, sounding almost casual. "Is it legal? No problem. I'll have Stark's legal team reach out to us. They've been swamped lately anyway." Tony gave a small, knowing smile. The law in America, he thought, was simply a playground for the wealthy, and once money enters the equation, it becomes a contest of who can outspend whom. The military may not want to pick a fight with Stark Industries, or Imperial Indu, Stries for that matter, but their real power lay in the deep-pocketed financiers backing them. Tony didn't care. For all their posturing, the Stark fortune was still an upstart compared to some of those century-old dynasties. But ever since he'd brought Ethan into the fold, Stark Industries had been unstoppable. "Mr. Stark, do you have a moment to talk?" Agent Coulson's voice cut through Tony's thoughts. He stepped forward once the general and his aides moved on. "About S.H.I.E.L.D., I'm assuming we're past the point of negotiations?" Tony arched an eyebrow. "You're jumping ahead, Agent Coulson. Let's start at the beginning." He gestured toward a nearby bench, the afternoon sun glinting off his Iron Man arc reactor. "But first, tell me exactly what you need." Ever since Hydra spirited Blonsky away, Ethan had lost faith in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s competence, and he couldn't shake the suspicion that Hydra agents lurked within its ranks. He flat-out refused to coordinate with them. Besides, his own secret Illuminati network was thriving, so Tony Stark was all too happy to wash his hands of the matter, except when Agent Coulson showed up. Coulson's solid track record earned him a few minutes of Tony's time now and then, but it was obvious Stark didn't trust S.H.I.E.L.D., and Coulson could do little about it. Ethan was perfectly content to let them stew. Ethan's current headache was Red Tank, a fanatical disciple of the evil god whose zeal gave him near-limitless endurance. Unlike Blonsky's brute gamma mutation, Red Tank drew power from sheer fanaticism, which made him terrifyingly difficult to contain. At Ethan's suggestion, Tony rigged the cell with a continuous aerosol delivery of ultra-high-dose sedatives, molecules fine enough that the drugs would be absorbed through Red Tank's skin and lungs without fail. It sounded foolproof. But by dawn, Red Tank had already adapted. He shrugged off the sedatives, smashed through his restraints, and nearly demolished the cell. Only Ethan's timely intervention, landing a single thunderous punch, sent him crashing back into unconsciousness. Since then, every escape attempt has ended the same way. Red Tank tests the perimeter, Ethan intercepts him in mid-charge, and one well-aimed blow sends him sprawling back behind bars. Day after day, the cycle repeats, until Red Tank either finds a new weakness or Ethan tires of the fight. Neither side shows any sign of slowing down. Tony had exhausted every conceivable method of incarceration, but nothing held up against Red Tank's extraordinary abilities. "It's not that we lack power," Tony admitted one afternoon, pacing the lab. "Even infinite energy won't help us if he can just shrug it off. But if we simulate a space environment, zero atmosphere, no points of thrust, we can cut off his propulsion. He won't be able to move, he'll just drift." Ethan paused, eyes narrowing as he considered the idea. "That's perfect." Tony shook his head with a grin. "I should have thought of it sooner. Out there, even the mightiest engines are useless without something to push against. No gravity, no air, no way for him to generate force. A perfect being becomes helpless. So here's the plan," Ethan said. "We build a repulsion generator to cancel out any residual forces, then enclose him in a gravity chamber set to 0G. He won't be able to fight or escape, he'll just hang there." Tony's excitement was palpable. Within hours, they'd assembled the device. A compact chamber lined with graviton emitters and repulsion coils. They ushered the captured Red Tank into its center and activated the system. Instantly, Red Tank's defiance evaporated. His limbs floated free, drifting as though he were stranded in the void itself. No matter how he thrashed, the repulsive field pushed him back into the same spot. He was utterly immobilized. A flicker of panic crept into Red Tank's eyes. He strove to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He was alive, yet he felt more helpless than in death. Suspended in a perpetual zero-gravity cage, he realized there was no escape, and no difference, he thought with bitter irony, between being trapped like this and being gone altogether. Tony studied the immobilized figure in the containment cage and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Red Tank thrashed desperately against his restraints, fists pounding the transparent barrier, an almost comical display of raw strength, and yet he couldn't break free. Worse still, he remained fully conscious, every second of his helplessness magnified in agony. "We've lowered the oxygen to just 0.1%, Tony explained to the others, tapping a control panel by the cage's side. "That way, the air itself can't conduct his power. It doesn't matter that he doesn't need to breathe. He still can't channel any of his abilities through the atmosphere." Bronsky shifted uneasily on his feet as he watched the crimson-armored powerhouse struggle inside. "Good thinking," he admitted. "But it's cruel." Tony shrugged. "Cruel? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. He can't move, he can't attack, and, best of all, he can still think. Imagine being trapped, forced to watch yourself utterly powerless. Every moment becomes its own kind of torture." Bronsky's eyes flicked back to Red Tank's gaunt, sweat-slicked face. Even in stasis, the super soldier's strength was undeniable. There was no mistaking that raw potential, but now it was rendered useless. "I never expected Ethan to be so formidable," he said quietly. Tony nodded, pride gleaming in his eyes. "Ethan's on another level. It's a shame we didn't have this technology sooner. Think of the criminals we could contain like this." Bronsky looked down at his own hands. He'd regained his human form, his unique powers intact, but utterly insufficient against Ethan's might. No matter how hard he pushed, he'd never match that level of raw force. "Let's just hope our leader doesn't abandon us," he muttered, more to himself than to Tony. Tony offered a reassuring nod. "With Ethan on our side, I don't think we'll be the ones left holding the bag." He gestured toward the cage. "Now, let's get back to work. The others won't stay locked up forever, at least not until we decide they shouldn't." Chapter 160. Hydra's Breakthrough. Norman slammed his tablet down as he read the latest report. If word of the Lizard Man got out, Osborne Industries would suffer devastating fallout, public outrage, regulatory crackdowns, a collapse in stock value. The very idea sent his blood boiling. He stormed into the secure wing of the covert laboratory, where the director waited behind a bank of monitors. "Explain yourself," Norman demanded. "How did the test subject escape?" The director, pale under the harsh LED lights, swallowed hard. "Sir, there was an unexpected mutation. The subject's strength skyrocketed, and it broke free in an instant. We couldn't contain it. Norman clenched his fists. And the data? I've erased every record, every video feed, the director assured him. No trace remains, Mr. Osborn. Norman rubbed his temples. Good, but this stops here. I've ordered all experiments halted immediately. Hydra's already onto the lizard serum. They'll trace that escape back to us if we leave anything intact. He leaned in, voice low and deadly serious. Destroy every vial of serum, incinerate every research file, leave nothing behind. The director hesitated. Sir, if we wipe it all out, won't that just confirm to Hydra that we're hiding something big? Norman's glare hardened. I don't care what it looks like. Do it now. Silence fell as the director nodded, already tapping commands into his console. Outside, the building's innocuous facade gave no hint of the horrors concealed within, and no clue that Osborn Industries had just pulled every lever to cover its tracks. Who doesn't know that Hydra is the most terrifying terrorist organization on the planet? I don't, Norman muttered to himself, still not fully convinced. He knew that this time, Hydra had been dealt another crushing blow at the hands of Ethan and Tony, and that 2 more Hydra operatives were now in custody. That, he told himself, was only a minor headache. After all, the chances of his own involvement in this particular mess were virtually zero. Norman winced at the thought of Ethan's scorn for his secret human testing program, but he reminded himself of the facts. His subjects were homeless people and retired soldiers who volunteered and were paid. None of them were mutants, so Ethan, never one to examine everything, had decided it wasn't his fight. Even Superman, with all his supervision and super hearing, couldn't pick up every atrocity in the world. In practice, it seemed his senses were just as selective as anyone else's. No, Norman's real headaches were Nick Fury's relentless phone calls and Agent Pierce's pointed questions from the office next door. Those 2 brothers in arms never let him forget that whenever Hydra stirred up trouble, it always ended up on Ethan's, and by extension Norman's, desk. Black Caesar finally slipped up. Pierce rubbed his temples. Blonsky and another Hydra operative had just been captured by Ethan, Tony Stark, and Bruce Banner. For the first time, Hydra's top brass, and Pierce himself, were beginning to see Black Caesar not as an invincible phantom, but as a man who could make mistakes. Of course, Pierce never believed leadership rested solely on brute strength. Charisma counted for more. He'd even taken a dose of the #1 compound himself, though he wouldn't mind a bit more muscle. Still, losing Blonsky to Tony and Bruce stung. Where are they holding him now? He asked the bald man with glasses seated across from him. Unknown, the man admitted, his shoulders slumping. We have no agents inside Stark's facility. Pierce narrowed his eyes. We need eyes on that place immediately. Contact our people, anyone who can slip in undetected. So far, no senior Hydra commanders had uncovered Black Caesar's true identity or location, which only added to the fear surrounding him. Unlike covert operatives who hid in the shadows, Black Caesar and his team operated in the open, flaunting their power. Now, feeling the first real blow to their organization, Hydra's leadership braced themselves for retaliation, and for the possible unraveling of their most secretive network. Ethan studied the latest intelligence reports. Whether Black Caesar's goons had stormed the military convoy to spring Blonsky or had brazenly snatched the lizard from a New York lab in broad daylight, one thing was clear: they left no clues. Their sheer audacity and their complete lack of subtlety left Colonel Pierce and his team deeply unsettled. Caesar's reach, it seemed, was far greater than any of them had ever imagined. But in the shadowy underworld, Hydra was supposed to sit at the very top. No other organization, neither the Hand nor the 10 Rings, had ever come close to matching its power. So how could anyone be running circles around them? Pierce paced the war room, his mind racing. He saw only 2 possibilities. Either Black Caesar had already infiltrated Hydra's ranks so flawlessly that no one had noticed the mole, or Caesar's syndicate truly did operate on a level above Hydra itself, an empire so vast and well-protected that it remained invisible even to the world's greatest criminal network. If Hydra was the undisputed sovereign of the global underworld, then Caesar must now rank among the darkest of its 5 most fearsome power players. The mere thought sent a chill through every man in the room. Agent Walker straightened his tie and gave a crisp salute. Understood, sir. He knew this mission was more than just another Hydra bust. Black Caesar's faction had been quietly growing in influence, so much so that whispers of discontent and ambition were spreading through the ranks. Walker had heard rumors. Operatives from other Hydra cells, disgruntled and hungry for advancement, were eager to transfer into Caesar's network. Officially, Hydra agents could request reassignment whenever they secured a sponsor and proved their worth. But no one outside Caesar's tight-knit circle had the clearance or the connections to make it happen. The legend of Black Caesar's power and the loyalty he inspired remained as much a barrier as it was a lure. In the command center, Nick Fury and Steve Rogers stood before a wall of monitors. Images of Bronsky and Red Tank, two of Hydra's most formidable operatives, flickered on screen in handcuffs. Fury tapped the glass. Finally got our hands on Bronsky and Red Tank. These two aren't small-time grunts. They're heavy hitters. They've got to know something. Rogers crossed his arms. If they're as high up as we think, debriefing them could expose Caesar's entire operation. Fury's expression darkened. That's the plan. But there's another problem. We need to move them and keep them secure. Tony, Banner, and Ethan are our best shot at head-to-head interrogation. But you know how it is. No one provokes that team and walks away unscathed. Not even the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Rogers nodded grimly. We'll set up a secure lab. Tony and Banner will take the lead. Ethan can support them from the inside. With the three of them working together, we stand a chance to break Caesar's silence and maybe cut off his recruits before he even knows we're coming. Fury gave a sharp nod. Then let's get to it. Time's not on our side. Steve Rogers leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Stark and the others aren't trained intelligence operatives. We could really use their help. Fury watched him coolly. We've already asked Stark to cooperate. He said he can handle this on his own. Steve frowned. Since the Hydra ambush, they'd used him as bait more than once, and every time, Hydra saw through the trap. It made him wonder if those so-called undead soldiers were actually superpowered operatives, and whether Hydra even had the capacity to produce them in large numbers. But now he'd learned that Ethan and Stark had managed to capture 2 Hydra operatives. This was exactly the break they needed. I'll go talk to him, Steve said, determination hardening his features. We shouldn't waste any more time. Those 2 captives are our best shot at finding out what Hydra's up to. Nick Fury stared at him for a long moment, weighing the options. Final, lie, he nodded. All right, I'll set up a meeting between you and Stark. Maybe it's time to see what he'll really do when push comes to shove. Steve exhaled in relief. Thanks, Nick. I'll handle it from here. He stood up, ready to push for the cooperation they desperately needed. Fury watched him go, silently hoping that this gamble would pay off. For the first time in weeks, there was a sliver of hope that Hydra's secrets might finally be within reach.